The moment the energy of deception and failure builds up to its limit, an underground labyrinth begins to form regardless of location. Around this creepy place, there are always a lot of terrible monsters. They guard the heart in which the artifact is located. The older the dungeon itself, the more valuable will be the artifact that lies within it. His finger had hardly touched the beautiful flower when suddenly he was stopped. The flower was very poisonous. The scared-to-death soldier yanked his hand and looked at the plant with round eyes. The traveler leading them forward ordered them not to tread an extra step if they wanted to live. His name was Stitch Atelair. He was an old explorer who'd seen a lot. The two knights. Apparently, the squad leaders asked if this was really the place. The men's faces showed concern. The dungeon in front of them was one of the oldest in the kingdom, and they were to visit every corner of it. The squad leader jumped up on his horse and ordered his deputy Balstock to unpack his baggage and line up the soldiers. The warrior looked at his commander in surprise. He means to say that they have already arrived. Gritting his teeth, the leader muttered that it had taken them a week to get here, and the round trip would take another week. Watching all this, Stitch involuntarily marveled at the coolness of this commander. Since he has so many soldiers, he is probably very influential. Yes, and besides, he had enough money to hire an A-class researcher. However, Stitch had no reason to refuse such a generous reward. His gaze once again fell on the dark dungeon that had a black fog emanating from it. It was no less dangerous than a rank A dungeon. The soldiers were ready and advancing at a brisk march. Stitch, standing aside, simply watched the army with admiration. The commander turned around and shouted to the explorer that they were moving out and it was time to go. The traveler immediately tensed up and applied his pathfinding ability. His body began to emit blue energy from afar. He looked like a firefly. Following that, he applied the beast instinct skill. These skills were beyond human capabilities, but could ease the way. It was by moonlighting as a sort of guide that Stitch made his living. Of course, because others can't see what he sees. The soldiers standing behind hesitated. This explorer didn't seem too trustworthy to them. Despite their doubts, the men moved right behind Stitch into the depths of the strange and dangerous dungeon. The guide walked in front, as he was supposed to do, and with a meaningful thumbs up, he ordered the others to watch their step and watch out for the ceiling. Balstock looked up in surprise, not realizing what could be up there. After a second, it was clear on the ceiling were huge bayonets, ready to snap at any moment and destroy anyone who passed beneath them. When asked in surprise, the boy replied every time he takes a step, he hears a spring creak behind the wall. Apparently the traps have long since rusted. But do not relax, everything here could still be dangerous. Stitch moved forward into the depths of the dungeon. The stunned guards were left standing in their place, not understanding how he was able to hear all this. Like a lizard, he crept deeper and deeper, bypassing all the traps with amazing agility. Another trap was easily disarmed with a light swing of a small dagger. He had no trouble disarming a few more mechanisms, but the next one would be more difficult. Entering the spacious room, Stitch stopped, and a small torchlight illuminated the surroundings. In this place, the dungeon protector should have been. This was the very stage through which the traveler could not break through on his own, needed the help of the troops. Balstock. Somehow, too quickly, was next to them asking if they were in place. The boy even flinched a little in surprise. Before they moved forward, the man ordered the shield bearers to move to vanguard to protect the main force. A second later, the soldiers were already under the powerful defense of the knights. There was only one question as to how they would awaken the dungeon protector. In fact, it was very simple. Throwing a small pebble, Stitch said that just need to give the monster a sign. As soon as the stone hit the concrete floor, a roar was heard from the depths of the dungeon and cold air blew in. The soldiers standing in front flinched slightly. However, they did not move from their seats. Stitch, standing behind everyone, was a little scared. Even though it was not the first time he met with such monsters, it was still scary. Soon, a creature appeared from the depths of the dungeon. First, a huge clawed paw came into view. Following that, a horrible lion-like face emerged from the shadows, huge fangs, burning eyes, and a thick mane. The guards standing in front were horrified at the sight of this monster. It was Tarask, the dungeon keeper. The monster had several stone spikes on its back, which served as a defense. Seeing the easy prey, Tarax let out a loud roar. Balstock ordered everyone to calm down and stop panicking. The front rank should move forward to the attack. The monster opened its mouth and released a jet of powerful flames from there. Luckily, the soldiers' shields were able to protect them from danger, but they still felt an unbearable heat. We must not let it break through the first line of defense. The commander loudly shouted orders, trying to drown out the roar of the monster. The first row of soldiers applied a wall of shields, blocking everyone else from the raging flames. The crossbowmen in the back row were ordered to aim directly at the monster's mouth where its weak point was. The fire was too strong, and visibility was almost nil to shoot. It was incredibly difficult. The commander himself realized that the monster was much stronger than expected. The flames made it impossible to see anything. Through the rumble, the commander shouted, "Could the boy use any ability to hit this thing?" But Stitch never did. Balstock asked, "Can a guy just target this thing? Nothing more is needed." Overcoming his fear, the explorer still picked up his crossbow and drew an arrow and aimed straight at the monster. Before something even worse happens, you just have to get to the center. The boy used his animal instincts. The arrow flew out of the crossbow, and with a whoosh of air, it went straight into the monster's mouth, ignoring the flames. Stitch, who had not expected such a success, opened his mouth in surprise and flapped his eyes. Tarasque threw his head back in pain and roared with such force that even the stones fell from the ceiling. The commander smiled, but it was too early to let his guard down. At the last moment, the researcher managed to dodge the monster's powerful blow. The shield of one of the warriors dented inward, and the poor soldier felt unbearable pain as if he had been hit by a battering ram. Stitch was trying to get out of the line of attack alone. He couldn't do anything. Despite the hail of arrows raining down directly on the monster, Tarasque ignored them and bounced them off of him as if they were toys. None of the crossbow attacks worked. The crossbowmen came to be horrified at their uselessness. The monster continued to smash everything around one after another. Soldiers fell from his powerful blows, and even the shield didn't help. Belstock shouted for everyone else to use a shield strike to knock the thing down, since it would have a hard time getting up. At this moment, scared to death, Stitch was in the very epicenter of events. Monster already has his paw to one powerful blow to crush him. At the last moment, a soldier came to the rescue and literally knocked the monster down with a powerful blow of his shield. Wasting no time, Belstock ran up to the monster from the side in a few great leaps and was already swinging his weapon. One swing of the sword, and the monster had already lost an eye and was roaring in incredible pain. Then came another powerful blow with his shield. Tarasque was gradually losing strength and was already struggling to stand on his feet. Mr. Harold bared his sword and prepared to unleash his final crushing blow on the monster. Jumping high up, he swung around. There were only a few moments left before the monster would be defeated. The beast let out its final roar, but its fate was already sealed. Harold, like a hawk, descended upon the beast and crushed it with his great sword. In one blow, it was all over. The traveler could not believe what he was seeing. Their commander was so strong that he could bring down such a monster with one blow. Harold, shining in his armor, looked around at the others with a victorious look as he continued to instinctively clutch his sword in his hands. The body of the defeated monster lay on the earth, and a pool of blood spread out from it. After the victory, joyous shouts flew into the air. The traveler's eyes lit up. He immediately thought about the artifact that was still in the heart of the dungeon. Suddenly, someone called out to him, and the boy turned his head in the direction of the voice. The column moved into the treasury, and there were mountains of gold everywhere. The herald asked the explorer, who was quite experienced but had never cleared a dungeon before. This question put the boy in a stupor, and he fell silent. It was a shame to admit, but it was true. The herald continued to reason. Their guide managed to pass all the traps without difficulty. However, reaching the center was not possible because of the defender. If the man's right, this is the first artifact the researchers ever seen in person. They stopped by the safe. Even the guards, who had seen a lot of things in their lives, were delighted by what they had seen and pulled back. Stitch stared at the shiny artifact in the center of the labyrinth, where they had come so far. The commander held the levitating artifact with one hand, and bringing it up to the boy offered him a touch. The artifact was a skull burning green flames. Stitch asked if they thought he could just take the artifact and run away. The ringleader grinned. Of course, the guy could take it and even try to get out of here, however would pay for it with his life. The traveler himself was well aware of that, so he was not going to steal anything. As agreed, except for the artifacts, everything here belongs to him. The guide reached out a trembling hand to the burning skull and felt a slight warmth. Something was wrong. The boy felt this pressure on his body that increased with each passing moment. He didn't even have time to say anything before he lost control of himself. Belstock was shocked and stared dazedly at the traveler, unable to help. Soon it was all over, and there was almost nothing left of the poor guide. Harold smugly grinned at the result of his perfidy. In what was left of the boy's hand lay a small artifact that caused such a horrible end. The soldier bent down to the traveler and wanted to take the artifact because the curse had already been broken, and there was nothing to fear. They stood there for a few more seconds, staring at the result of their dastardly actions that had led to this end. It was time to get out of this place. The skull became bigger and brighter. Furthermore, the expression on his face changed and became terrifying. The boy's hand that held the ring was covered with some kind of ivy-like growths. Belstock, trying to shield himself from the blinding light, called out to his commander. Mr. Harold trembled with fear, but still did not take his eyes off the horrifying sight. The boy's body began to deform in a strange way. The clothes on his body were vaporizing, and his eyes were burning with green fire. The soldier swung his sword, ordering the others to fall back. If they wanted to live, the situation was taking a dangerous turn. As soon as the order sounded, the crossbowmen pointed their guns directly at the unknown creature, and a hail of arrows rained down. It was all useless. The herald couldn't believe what was happening. Could it be that scumbag Sino ecotype? It was too late to ponder. The guy turned into a vague silhouette, hovering above the ground. The man retreated a few steps back in fear. The artifact's reaction was immediate. Everything around it began to shake, and the dungeon collapsed. The soldier tried to reason with his commander, saying they should run, but the man froze in place. Seeing that his commander was standing motionless, Belstock took out a scroll from his pocket to return. It was their only chance to survive. The leader was still standing motionless, watching the monstrous silhouette increasing in size each time. There was anger and horror in his eyes that this boy had taken and ruined everything. He was about to draw his sword to cut the monster down, but his assistant grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the exit. Stitch's exhausted body flew down into the black abyss, like a piece of cloth. Fortunately, he managed to survive, and barely alive, he was lying on the bank of a strange underground river whose water was green in color. His eyes slowly began to open, and the first thing he saw was a clenched hand occasionally glinting with green light. With an inhuman effort, the boy tried to rise to his feet, despite the incredible pain in his entire body. Water slowly began to come out of his lungs. Rushing out through his mouth, he finally began to breathe normally. Exhausted, he fell with a wet sound onto the cold stone. What this place was completely unclear. His body felt like it was being torn apart, but something caught the boy's attention, something glowing not far from him. When he looked down at his hand, he was surprised to see that the artifact was now on his middle finger in the form of a ring. Understanding was hard to come by, because after he was deceived by the herald, Stitch remembered nothing. He thought he had said goodbye to life. His musings were interrupted by a terrible voice that confirmed the theory that the boy in front of him was the same blazing skull. Their gazes crossed, and a pack of goosebumps of fear ran down the traveler's body. Now the herald and his squad were in relative safety upstairs. He still couldn't believe that they had managed to escape from this hell. Sitting on the ground, the warrior cursed all living things, while the aide sitting next to him tried to calm his lord down. All his attempts were in vain. The man was furious at his failure, and so trivial. There was real rage glittering in his eyes, and why Belstock had only used the scroll of return. Belstock looked at his hand in horror and clenched it into a fist. It was bad enough that there was no other way out. But no matter how much he tried to look at the gentleman's face, one could tell that he would not calm down so easily. From impotent anger, the commander hit his aide with his fist right in the chest, taking his anger out on him. The man inconsolably covered his face with his hands and thought that his brothers must have already found out that he had led the soldiers. The memory again brought back fragments of when they had begun to transform before their eyes into a monster. It was the first time the experienced soldier himself had encountered something like this. Perhaps it was an independent artifact. The Lord grumbled all conclusions were wrong. It was a symbiotic-type artifact. Quite expectedly, his aide had never heard of such a thing. Goosebumps ran down his back at the mere mention of it. Harold explained, usually artifacts are divided into two types, the most common of which is independent. Most of all, there are artifacts of this type that obey the will of their owner. Harold added that the exceptional type is the symbiotic type that can revitalize hosts. It finally came to Belstock that the resurrection they had seen was the result of such an artifact. It was hard to believe that amidst the collapsing dungeon, this kid could survive even with such a powerful thing. Harold sighed heavily and wished that the petty thief who had stolen the artifact would disappear forever. But for now, he needed to return to the capital. Lastly, he gave orders in every town they passed through to put up wanted notices about Stitch Atheler. At the same time, the guy was lying on the ground trying to figure out what kind of place he had gotten into. As soon as he tried to use his animal instinct, a bolt of lightning struck his body. It turns out that the artifact could fight back. And more than that, it had consciousness. The skull reappeared in the light and still looked just as menacing. Listening to all this nonsense, Stitch could not believe his ears. Skull grinned. He was just saying that he had lost some of his energy because of that inept brat. Stitch didn't pay attention to the demon's story. He was wondering why he was hearing the voice in his head. Skull barked out that his name was actually Memento Mortem, and at that phrase, his voice became even more menacing. A little. Coming to his senses, the traveler tried to get to his feet. Means the demon says that is this artifact, and besides, there are no more of these. Despite the strangeness of the situation, the guy was glad they could communicate with each other. Grabbing onto the crack, he tried to climb up to get out of this place, while asking what other abilities the artifact had. At first, he even managed it, all the while the boy was pondering how much he could get for this marvelous artifact. But his ascent didn't last long. At some point, the poor thing couldn't hold on and flew straight down with a thud and fell to the ground. After the skull said that for him, you can get at least 40 abilities, Stitch did not believe. After all, a person cannot have more than 10. But with an artifact like this, he had a lot more control, and that was good. Rising to the ground, he wondered if he could get any more abilities. Skull answered yes, but he was short on mana at the moment. They chatted until the guy had climbed the mountain after all, and what mana he still couldn't understand. Memento shrieked, as if remembering something by the way the boy only had 12 hours left. Exactly how much time until the end of his time? As soon as Stitch heard the news, everything inside him turned upside down. The realization came too late. As long as the artifact lives, and the guy will stay alive, and vice versa. Did the boy think he would come back to life for nothing? The demon continued to smile, and green fire erupted from his mouth. The realization hammered on his head, and Stitch realized the deplorability of his situation. And where did he get his strength from? But by some miracle, he broke out of the cave in a split second and was already running down the forest path. The demon chuckled softly. He was not a mere mortal. Life was of little interest to him, and he slept peacefully until the boy came and awakened him. But still, if it was already difficult for him to survive, the demon would share its power with him, and the energy around the boy's hand began to coil again. However, let Stitch learn that he awakened the demon does not mean that he became its master, and clinging to life here, it is he and not the demon. Already unable to bear it, asked since recovering his Manu. All you need to do is use devour curses against weak monsters or cursed tools. He wasn't entirely sure about the cursed tools, but the monsters were easy to find. All the time he was running, the demon drove him every time, counting down by a minute, which annoyed Stitch. Trying to use his animal instinct, the poor guy felt pain all over his body and forgot about the lowering of his characteristics. Then I'll have to look for them myself, but there were some animal tracks nearby, which made it easier to find them. In addition, there was an unbelievable stench that even stung their eyes, so they were on the right track. Hiding behind the nearest bushes, the traveler saw a large wolf that was devouring its prey. That was great news. I just need to know how long the downgrade will last. In the same droning voice, the demon answered with 1 minute and 30 seconds to go. It's from lack of mana, but there's still time. The boy hid in the bushes and got ready to throw. It's a good thing there was only one wolf. If there were several, it would have been more difficult, and he could handle this one. Even though he hadn't recovered yet, Stitch was eager to fight. Perhaps the demon had some attacking skills. Luckily, there was one air bullet. It's a basic ability that all mages use, but it could be fired once. If that's the case, you should aim for the heart, or lung, or other vital organs. This was the only way they could destroy the monster and recover some mana. Stitch put his hand out in front and ordered don't shoot until he told him to. The demon didn't really seem to want to listen to him, and without waiting for a command, he immediately fired. The recoil was so strong that the traveler barely had time to stay on his feet in order for them to fly far away into the bushes. The skill immediately destroyed the monster in one go, making the boy's eyes water. After that, I couldn't believe that it was just basic magic, but it couldn't be that powerful. He was a little scared of his own power, and even more so of the fact that he wasn't in full control of it. The demon grumbled unhappily. He was not just a toy, but an artifact with consciousness. Better let Stitch finally take his prey. Deciding not to argue for the time being, the still frightened Stitch moved forward. With great caution, he looked at the destroyed monster that was still causing his entire body to tremble. Reaching forward, he allowed the demon to devour the curse and finally recover. The royal castle was really stunning. It possessed a large courtyard with a swimming pool in the center. King Botarus had 3 offspring claiming his throne. The first son's name was Reptores, who was apparently the oldest. The other was called Alfred, who had a high intellect and the same cunning. And third directly to the Herald, who became famous as a warrior and warlord. Since Reptores is the eldest son, he is the first claimant to the throne, so the middle and youngest try to prove their superiority. The Herald was inconsolable. He had failed to obtain the artifact, and now everyone would look at him with contempt, since he had failed the only opportunity. He and his assistant were approaching the royal castle with only one thought of the soothsayer in his mind. Most likely the heir was talking about Prince Alfred's henchman named Conrad. This bastard is notoriously cunning and slippery as a worm, impossible to keep track of. The Lord blamed himself for putting too much trust in the Alliance's testimony, though in fairness, the curse did lie on this artifact. It was still unknown whether or not the Alliance was specifically asking for details from them, but there was nothing the prince could do about it. Balstock, who tried to reassure his master, assured him that the Lord would surely overcome everything. They were heading down the wide road, straight to their clan's fortress. The prince could not get used to what was happening, but he thanked his assistant. At this time, absorbed mana to restore his artifact and hoped it would be enough. Skull grudgingly gritted his teeth and said that for now, that would be enough for taking the life of this monster's mana had only recovered 15%. The adventurer thought these people must be looking for him. After all, he had taken the artifact with him. He was more concerned with where to settle down now. In a small town was boiling life on the cozy streets, founded people scattered on their business. At the entrance to the settlement stood 2 guards watching the surroundings closely. It was almost impossible to pass. Hiding behind a nearby tree, Stitch pondered how he could get in if the entrance was guarded. Luckily, his gaze spotted a small flower in the thick grass. It was catgrass. It had to work. First, we had to get fire, which was easy enough. And if you mix it with Flemon's powder, it makes a great sleeping pill. Although it only works on humans, it's enough for now. Besides, it's already finished. The guards didn't immediately notice what was wrong, and when they did, it was too late. As soon as the smoke hit my nose, my consciousness immediately began to cloud. It only took a few seconds for the guards to fall into a deep sleep. The demon, who was flying nearby, marveled at the boy's ingenuity. Stitch was proud to say during this time he had already traveled to many places and had become an experienced explorer. However, his boast was interrupted by something as his gaze fell on something suspicious. And there was nothing to worry about. There was a placard with his face on it saying that a thief was wanted, for whom the reward was 400 crowns. Memento chuckled softly, and soon changed to laughter, at which time the boy crumpled the poster with fury. Let them now walk and look back. Who knows how much they have already managed to hang in the soul, appeared anxiety here, and the fool understands that in this village, normal life is not seen. On the other hand, there's nothing to worry about as long as he's got that ring on his finger. He crumpled the paper again, and the demon, noticing his mood, asked him if he wanted revenge. Throwing the paper into the nearest river, replied, except a total spitfire wouldn't want revenge, but that the demon laughed loudly. This encouraged Memento, and he even offered his help, because as long as he was on the guy's finger, he was invulnerable, but he didn't trust him. Skull again stretched in a predatory smile, and said that his powers and abilities depend on the amount of absorbed mana. Let Stitch think, what is the point? The more it absorbs, the stronger it becomes, and if you can absorb something big, you can become many times stronger. Not really believing this absurdity, the boy asked his companion if he could absorb other artifacts or not. The demonic creature laughed and said that he could pass his power to the boy, and that's the phrase that sent shivers down my spine. If Stitch helps him get his hands on the artifacts, he'll gain unprecedented power. Eyes lit up. It was a chance to get his revenge, execute his plan, and Demon gets the power, and everyone gets a win-win. The images of that arrogant herald freak immediately began to appear in his head, and in principle, one blow would be enough for him in such a case. Still not fully believing their happiness, the guy clarified all of the above. He wanted to know for sure. In a sweet voice, the demon continued to assure the boy that it was all true. He would let him feel what it was like to smash his opponents into the walls. The spacious tavern was filled with soft, dim lights. There were many people drinking and having fun. One of the visitors leaned on the counter and called Dalton the tavern owner, asking where he could buy good leather at a decent price around here. In front of him appeared a huge man with a lush black beard, coughing. He said that for such a question, you need to go to the black market. The visitor sipped irritably from his mug, saying that these bastards demanded at least 500 crowns, to which Dalton offered him a good researcher. His broad hand reached for the wanted ad, and the man raised an eyebrow in surprise. The visitor replied that he could hang himself if he wanted. The tavern owner took a closer look at the boy on the poster, as if he knew him. Stitch looked at him with a vacant stare, wondering what he'd done again. A hand reached forward for a sign with a permission slip that allowed passage inside, and without it, the visitor risked losing some of their belongings. At the entrance again, there were guards who did not let anyone through without a sign, and at Stick, there was no such sign, but in such places, there is always a secret passage. Hiding behind a tree, the boy thought that good goods always come in, only through the black market demon didn't understand, and what he forgot in this village. Not paying attention to the demon and moving behind the wall, the guy said that climbing the dungeon without scrolls is like taking your own life. Obviously, Stitch was talking about the return scroll, and it's convenient that the black market is full of offers. A smile immediately spread on her face, and her eyes lit up with happiness. After a few seconds, the secret passage was found, but the skill of the explorer was still evident. After knocking a few times, Stitch called out the password, "Goblins eat freshwater base." There was silence for a couple of seconds, and then a disgruntled voice was heard from the aisle. Scrunching up his face with a smile at Stitch, apologized. He hasn't looked in these parts for a long time, so he doesn't know much. Recognizing the voice of his old acquaintance, Dalton literally rose from the ground and immediately enclosed the poor boy in his arms, almost breaking his bones. The poor man exhaled and said that everything was fine. He had an urgent case and didn't have time to think of something else. Laughing loudly, Dalton asked if this was the kid who said the back door wasn't for him, but still the man was glad to have an old acquaintance. Hospitable host invited the dear guest to his tavern, which was already full of people, and even offered him a drink for the meeting that Stitch refused. Dalton, who had already seen the announcement, asked why he had stolen something. Rumors spread pretty quickly, and Stick dumped his loot on the table. So he's got energy-boosting claws and the high-end leather he got from the Great Wolf. Let them raid before they're dismantled. Having sat down on the nearest bench and sighed heavily, Stick asked, "How much are the scrolls of return here?" To which Dalton named the price of 600 crowns. At the boy's request for a loan, the man laughed and shook his head negatively, and it was useless to ask. The traveler's face turned stony. He didn't expect such a warm welcome, but still Dalton asked how much he needed. Stitch will give the money the day after tomorrow. Remembering the wanted list, the man still asked what the boy had stolen. Noticing that he couldn't get away from the explanation, he sighed and said that one son of the local king had been acting too brazenly, so he needed to teach him a lesson. The tavern owner laughed, but boasting with pride at such a price was not very wise either. He had a friend who knew scrolls. Dalton pulled out a quill and a piece of paper, asking what else was needed if a new weapon was needed. Have him ask Clyde for payment, he would generously put the payment in his name. Already making himself at home, Stitch asked him for provisions and walked over to the hooded man sitting next to him. The boy's fist came down beside him with incredible force, immediately waking the sleeper. The old man raised his head, his face wrinkled, and began to mutter some swear words to himself. coughing constantly. As soon as Clyde opened his mouth, there was a smell of booze, so strong you could have fainted. It was only evening, and he was already so drunk. When poor Clyde heard such harsh language, he immediately burst into tears, and so he gives his goods away for half price, and still no one buys them. He already considered himself a loser on the table, lay a lot of goods, but the poor guy never managed to sell a single one. With a meaningful thumbs up, Styx said he felt like making a favorable offer. So what weapons are here but only the finest? The boy looked around at the assortment of goods. Clyde's eyes widened in disbelief, and he even started to stutter. But don't let it fool you that the boy doesn't have much money, but still. Let him sell him a cheaper one, and let him test it, and tell him how the product feels. The boy's choice fell on a small gun. He began to aim and try on. He would like some legendary weapon for less he would not settle for. Clyde instantly sobered up and was already smiling with a full mouth. You have to choose a weapon that will fit in your hand. The seller immediately offered him a large hammer, which caused the boy's genuine delight. Memento suddenly appeared, warned that the dungeons are mostly narrow passages. Such bulky weapons would simply be useless. At first, the boy agreed, but immediately looked at his companion fearfully, at how he was even here he will be seen, but the demon assured that only Stitch could see him. This dwarf definitely has no magical power, but the equipment is another conversation demon and Presagimia. Weapons that turned out to be very interesting. He's very talkative today, doesn't he know how it works? Memento grudgingly pointed out that he's an artifact and sees things differently. Squinting his eyes, he noticed that if something was to be taken, it would be the sword on the far right. Soon, the companions were at the entrance to another dungeon tantalizingly unknown. Stitch has already tested the strength of the monsters here, which turned out to be unusually strong. Dozens of burning eyes stared at the boy from another failure. Without wasting a second, he pointed his artifact towards the monsters, ordering it to incinerate all living things. The demon didn't think for long, and released a huge jet of powerful energy forward, eating the curse. Memento could feel his power growing for him. It was like an easy walk. Stitch wasn't faintly surprised to learn that the demon was using the excess energy to grow. In this case, a good solution would be to mine lapis lazuli, and they were in just the right place. Without wasting a second, the traveler began to chisel the nearest lapis lazuli crystals with his pickaxe, and a clatter began to echo throughout the cave. One thing was unclear, why there were traps at every turn, but on the other hand, it was a good thing that they could be used for spare parts. The boy was distracted from looking at the next mechanism by a strange sound coming from somewhere on the side of the cave. Shifting his gaze toward the dark tunnel, it was clear that the sounds were indeed coming from there. Pointing his artifact right there, Stitch asked for a little light, because he couldn't see anything. What was there gave me goosebumps instantly. A huge monster was approaching from the darkness. It was a mineral lizard. The moment it opened its mouth, it became clear it was the one making those nasty noises. Stitch dropped the pickaxe from his hands and was stunned by the horror he saw. The lizard leisurely approached him, looking at him with its red eyes. The deceptive calm didn't last long. The monster opened its maw and spat fire directly at the boy. Luckily, the intruder had time to bounce off, but still hurt his shoulder. The t-shirt there vaporized instantly. It sucks to be caught by a very nerdy monster who uses poisonous minerals. His body is as strong as steel, and he can't even be scratched, let alone killed, by a mid-level force. If that was the case, there was no other option but to destroy it with my amulet. The demon seemed to have a different opinion. The boy must be crazy if he used the skill in this cave. It would cause a cave-in, but still he fired. Despite the demon's joy, Stitch didn't understand what good it would do if everyone died, but it was a great chance to test the new weapon. I couldn't believe it had to be done right now, but it seemed the demon was determined. Preventing indignation, the demon asked Stitch if he would keep him safe until the meeting with the dungeon keeper was such a good time. Despite his inner doubts, the traveler still pulled out his sword and also a vial of liquid. In one deft motion, he inserted the vial into the weapon and pressed until the characteristic click. The moment of truth. Holding the sword in his hands and approaching the monster, Stitch no longer thought about anything. After running a few meters on the move, dodging blows, he jumped up and pointed his blade straight at the monster. A crunch was heard as the tip entered the crystal, but failed to penetrate it. The stoic did not intend to give up, but used his sword in an attempt to break the monster's tough shell. After a moment and a lot of effort, the carapace gave way with a crunch, opening up access to the monster's weak spot. Now it was time to retreat. Jumping off the body of the huge lizard, the guy landed a few meters away from it. Rubbing his numb hand, Stitch turned around, still not fully realizing that victory was his. He didn't manage to chop the lizard, but only stuck a sword into it, which was quite a shame. On the other hand, he won. And that's the main thing, was even a bit of a shame that he lost his weapon, even though Stitch bought it to test it. There were still a few vials of gas in the bag, which wasn't easy to get, and only 4 capsules left. Interrupting the boy's joy, the demon said something was wrong here. It couldn't be that simple. Memento didn't know what was wrong, but his senses were not failing him. With a weary look, Stitch looked at him, saying that sometimes it was very difficult to understand a demon. It was too early to relax anyway. Too short a fight could also be a trap, and as it turned out, a creature's voice came from somewhere. Another lizard of the same kind was approaching them with great speed. At this point, Stitch was very glad that he hadn't spent all the capsules in a place like this. You have to save money. The monster moved smoothly, and at the same time, fast, the paw with huge claws was already approaching its victim. Instinctively, the guy dodged, but still felt the imminent danger flying a few centimeters from his body. Although it was a good moment to attack, the monster was much faster and blocked the incoming blow. The monster's strength was astonishing. To be able to stand on one's feet after such a blow was a great achievement. Gritting his teeth, Stitch looked before him with a fierce look. Now the monster's power was beginning to worry him. The tail alone was starting to get on my nerves. Though compared to the Tarrasque encountered earlier, it's just a small, defenseless lizard. As he prepared for another throw, the Stitch gathered all his strength and gripped the hilt of his sword even tighter. The lizard blocked all the blows, with enviable persistence, keeping his opponent at a distance. The monster's skin was much harder than the previous one, and it was much harder to break through. After flying off a dozen meters, the poor guy flopped on his back, and he immediately caught his breath. The demon continued to snicker at him. It was already clear that this enemy was much stronger than the previous one, but even such a creature must have weaknesses. The boy did not have time to finish his thoughts, as a huge clawed paw was already approaching his face. There was nothing he could do in such a situation, and the beast grasped his face with incredible strength. Despite Demon's mutterings, Stitch said that everything was going according to plan, and there was nothing to worry about. While the creature held the boy's face, he was preparing for his strike. If you mix Flemon's powder and fireflies, you get something interesting. The right thing to do is to attack the weaknesses of the time, left less and less time to act quickly. As soon as the reagents came into contact with each other, there was a bright flash of light. The lizard didn't even immediately realize what was happening. The blinded monster opened its mouth and thus exposed itself to the sword's tip. Despite the warning, the boy jumped up to the monster and aimed his full power right into its jaws. He didn't hear the demon's voice yelling for him to stop, and at the same second, there was an explosion. Luckily, he managed to stay alive, and all thanks to the power of the talisman that brought the boy back to life. The demon continued to rage and shout, but Stitch didn't listen to him. His head just splintered as if it had been hit with a hammer. Unable to understand what had happened, the lucky man whirled his head in different directions. Turns out the monster's magic had begun to control the kid's body, though it was a vague explanation. Where the monster stood, there was only scorched earth. Still, the demon and himself didn't realize how it happened. Stitch asked him what to be wary of the next monsters exploding. Skull grinned, not wanting to admit it, but denying the fact. The demon smiled, noticing the fear on his ward's face. However, Stitch did not even think of panicking, yet he would not be intimidated by such nonsense. With his hand on the ground, he activated the pathfinding ability, and dozens of glowing lines immediately began to diverge from his hand. Even though he had applied animal instinct, I had no hint of nearby monsters. After a few meters, he saw something strange, a pile of bones covered in crystals. I couldn't quite believe it was Monster Stitch, raised an eyebrow in surprise. Memento grinned in annoyance and confirmed that it was in fact a monster. They might as well look like this. The strange thing was that this thing didn't react even if you approached it. Perhaps it just lay there long enough and froze. Noticing the boy's interest, the demon strictly forbade him from approaching these creatures, or they might detonate, and then it would be even worse. It was a sensible idea, and Stitch turned his back on the monster, but something caught his eye. As soon as he turned his eyes back to his field of vision, something strange came into his field of vision. The entire skeleton, or rather the crystals surrounding it, began to glow, and this light did not bode well. Not even a second after the deafening explosion, the blast wave threw the boy's puny body several dozen meters away. Thank God he survived, but he was badly shaken. Strange was that, even without touching the monster, here detonated very little. There were colorful crystals everywhere, looking much more beautiful than anything he had seen before. With the thought that he could make a nice profit, Stitch reached for one of the crystals. But as soon as he touched it, an electric wave passed through his body, weak but still palpable. It looked strange to say the least, but the demon finally realized what had been bugging him. Covering his nose with his hand, Memento said that the entire dungeon was filled with magical power, and the deeper they went, the stronger it became. As a consequence, the monsters they meet begin to react faster and explode more violently. Stitch glanced at his companion and suggested that it must have made them more aware of their surroundings. The demon added that apparently because of what happened, it's not just monsters that are affected. The bad feeling grew stronger, and a horrible thought came into my head that this passage was a real minefield. Smirking, Memento added, it wasn't all bad news because of the strong magic. The boy wouldn't be able to use even a simple recovery skill. Besides, as he believes in such a situation, an escape scroll is also of little use. The worst possible thought came to itself. Escape is simply impossible. Despite all of this, the good news too is the demon rushed to reassure the boy. The destruction of this creature might help them get out of here. Despite all their searches, they were never able to find the source of this unfortunate magic. The only thing left to do was to check the huge door nearby. There was only one option. The doors creaked open, and a strange picture appeared. Somewhere in the distance, a bright blue ball was blazing. The boy's eyes immediately widened in confusion as to what it was, but the demon hastened to clarify by saying that it was Jin. But what is the spirit doing here? If you look closely at the core, you can feel something. The companion was trying to give Stitch the right idea. It was actually an artifact, since spirits are born at the fusion of power and magic. No sooner had they finished their thought than the boy needed to retreat urgently because Jin started to attack first. It turned out that this guardian is the cause of all their troubles. His body merged with the artifact and sprays magic in all directions. That's why the dungeon has turned into a minefield. You need to destroy the epicenter. Stitch already realized it himself and ran forward, despite the fact that several shards were already flying at him. With the help of his weapon, he was able to repel the attack, which cost him a lot of strength. But as luck would have it, the demon was late in warning that the concentration of strange magic was much higher in this place. Despite the advice to run away, the guy remained standing still and stared in surprise at Jin. There was something strange there. Jin began to warp and Stitch became numb and heard nothing but the beating of his heart. If it hadn't been for his companion's shout that brought him to his senses, there would have been nothing left of the boy, for Jin had launched an energy jet in their direction. Bouncing aside and prepared, despite his fatigue, Stitch approached the genie. Even a body made entirely of stone must have weaknesses. The explorer decided to take advantage of this and swung his sword. He managed to strike and even chipped off a small pebble that flew off to the side. To his great surprise, the stone came back and hit the unfortunate man right in the jaw with tremendous force. So much so that his mind even went blank. The stone flew on its own and circled around the fallen boy. Sitting on the ground and recovering a bit, Stitch was thinking about how he could do some damage to him, not to mention a full attack. The answer came to itself: you have to aim for the middle where the artifact is. Then there was no other option left. He aimed his artifact straight into the middle, straining every muscle. Naturally, it wasn't all that simple preventing the attack. Jin released his powerful jet of energy. At the last moment, the hero still managed to bounce to the side, leaving the line of attack, but it was still dangerous. The demon in the ring was a little frightened himself and shouted for him to get out of here. Stitch gathered all his strength and still bounced away, but still felt this powerful blast wave. With a horrified look upward, one could see that the huge stone was about to collapse. There was no time to think. He had to save his life and jumped aside to avoid being crushed. His attacks were useless, but he kept trying, and Stitch swung his sword again in an attempt to do some damage. There was a powerful blow, and shards of stone flew in different directions. The blade was stuck in the hard rock, and there was no way to get it out of there. Still holding on to the hilt of his sword, Stitch realized what a fucked up situation he was in. His body felt a powerful blow, and the boy flew away for several dozen meters, hurting his back. As he tried to collect his head, he couldn't figure out why this monolith hadn't collapsed yet. The snickering demon reminded him that he already seemed to be saying that magic skills couldn't be used against this thing. It was too late to ponder anyway. Several charged rocks were flying at them, and about ready to flatten every last one of them. By closing his weapon in time, the traveler was still able to delay his demise, but for how long it would last. Jin was now definitely intent on destroying every living thing here and was launching attacks with enviable frequency. Finger asked the boy if he was alive there, to which he replied that it didn't feel as if he was hitting solid ice. The boy was plunged into reflection, but a huge stone block was already flying at him, as his partner insistently told him. He rushed straight towards the monster with all his might, but there was no choice but to use Clyde's weapon. The sword had already been tattered, but it was still relatively intact, and it was necessary to hit one place, even if it was small, but there was a chance of victory. After touching, Stitch felt an incredible recoil and could not stand on his feet. For such he was certainly not ready. If he uses the capsule now, he'll only have one. If he misses, he's finished. Suddenly something changed. The Stitch raised his head and looked at Jin, for something was clearly going on. He was pulled out of his musings by the same voice of the demon, ordering him to dodge rather than just stand. This time, he didn't have time to react, and a huge boulder flew into him, and he felt as if he had been hit by a train. Lucky for him, the guy was still alive, but badly bruised and numb. The demonic artifact didn't miss an opportunity to tease the boy. Of course, this is going to be off topic, but his body is starting to show a reaction, and it's changing with every second. In an exhausted voice, an exhausted Stitch asked how much time would be left until his body was completely changed. With some sympathy in his voice, the demon replied that it was basically about 3 minutes, but looking at his condition, it might be less. His eyes immediately lit up, and that should be enough. The boy's body was awakened with unprecedented strength. Even in this state, he was ready to fight. From the last of his strength, he rose to his feet, still holding onto the hilt of his nearly broken sword. In a situation like this, 1 or 2 minutes would be enough. The goal was clear. As he sprinted, he pushed off and flew straight into the middle. Putting his hand with the ring forward, he applied an air bullet. Due to his lack of strength, even such a skill threw him far backward. But everything went according to plan while the artifact was trying so hard to protect the core, then it slowed down, leaving upwards unprotected where Stitch aimed his blade. The sword went in almost all the way, and there was a tremendous explosion that shook everything around him. For some reason, the boy did not move. He still sat holding the hilt of his weapon, and did not even pay attention to the demon's screams. Something was wrong. He couldn't get the weapon out of the stone. It couldn't have happened. He'd worked so hard. Would it all be for nothing? His eyes were filled with fear for his own life. The idea came with itself in his hands immediately. A lapis lazuli stone was their salvation. Ignoring his ally's squeal, Stitch swung the stone with the intention of driving it straight into the monster's heart. It all worked out, but the explosion threw him back many meters, so he just had to hope he didn't break anything. With the last of his strength, he opened his eyes to see that this crystal had finally cracked, which meant it wasn't all for nothing. The arm stretched out on its own, the devouring curses were beginning to take effect. It was time to call it a day. In the end, everything was done and the monster was consumed. One could consider their luck to be good. Eventually, getting out of the dungeon, the first thing that wanted to do was to fall to the ground, which Stitch did. Stretching his arms forward, he stretched sweetly. Celebrating inwardly his victory, recovery returned to him and immediately healed his wounds. Hands and feet also seemed to be in place. Clothes, after a fight, always looked like this condition check. He decided to leave for the morning. The skills of beast instincts and curse devouring had surprisingly increased, but he couldn't help but be happy, although he hadn't even hoped to pump up the beast instinct. The ring continued to glow by the way the demon should have come out by now, but for some reason it fell silent. Suddenly, another green-colored sign appeared. Stitch was frightened and shrieked in surprise. It seems to be a demon. To the great surprise became available a few more skills. That's just not clear why so many. When Stitch returned to the tavern to find that the sword was broken, Clyde was inconsolable. He promised to repair it and even strengthen it. Sighing in relief, Stitch was glad if the master himself had nothing to worry about. Then pointing his hand at the items, he added that they were loot from the monsters he had managed to destroy in the dungeon. There was also an advance payment, and next to it was a bag full of gold coins, glistening in the light of the lamps, and there were about 3,000 crowns. With so much gold, Clyde's eyes bulged so much that they barely stayed in place. The man couldn't even say anything. Without further explanation, Stitch waved his hand and went about his business, wishing the master a good job. Night had already fallen on the city when the boy came to the tavern of his old friend Dalton, and the light was burning in the windows as always. Standing behind the counter, the owner of the establishment happily greeted the old acquaintance with his usual broad smile on his face. Scratching the back of his head, the visitor sighed and asked snidely if Dalton himself had recently scolded him about the dungeon, or if he had simply enjoyed the loot. After a short conversation, Stitch waved his hand and went upstairs to rest, followed by Dalton, who said that if he needed anything, he could contact him at once. The bartender wondered for a long time. He really didn't think this guy could take down a dungeon by himself. Stitch slipped into his room and immediately collapsed on the soft bed, which seemed to him the most comfortable place on earth. As soon as he got his thoughts in order, he immediately began to wake his companion with enviable persistence. It was evident from everything that Memento was very much irritated. He said himself that his head felt as if it were in prostration. I asked him until he activates his new abilities. He can't find out anything. The demon squinted his eyes and nodded his head at the whole thing. When the two of them met, the demon rebooted, leaving many abilities sealed. The already tired guy said if the demon can't say anything new, then don't repeat yourself. Memento seemed annoyed he wouldn't be able to explain in words, but it felt like he was remembering something long forgotten. But now, the main thing is to rest a little, because too much energy has been spent, and the night is long gone. It only took a few minutes for Stitch to fall into a sound sleep, but something was wrong. He didn't get a good night's sleep a minute later, when he was awakened by a loud knock on the door and the bartender's concerned voice. Without waiting for an answer, Dalton burst into the room, and the first thing he said was the word Clyde, and it was obvious that the man was very worried. Quickly waking up, Stitch along with Dalton went down to the hallway where several people were already waiting for them. He opened his eyes even wider, and the sleep was instantly gone. The fact was that Clyde, recently alive and well, now looked like he'd been in a personal fight and lost. There were already a lot of people around, but no one could explain what had happened. One of the visitors found him lying in the alley. The owner of the establishment quickly uncorked a vial of red life-giving potion and brought it up to the victim's face. Dalton simply poured the contents right on the poor man's face, despite Stitch's indignation. Despite all this, after applying the potion, the old man's face took on a healthy appearance. Surprisingly good product. Stick asked how much such a thing costs. The potion wasn't cheap, but when else would it be used if not for this kind of thing? And by the way, Clyde was starting to come around. The poor guy clutched his head, not realizing where he was or what had even happened to him. His mind was all jumbled up, but the old man clearly remembered that it was all connected with Derek Feggery, one of the attackers Clyde had seen among his six. For a second, there was silence between everyone, no one realizing who this guy was. Only Dalton, mousing his forehead, said it was one jerk who had a nasty temper. But until now, the man had tried to turn a blind eye. One time, that little punk made a mess in front of everyone, but Dalton explained it to him in a clear way. I guess this is the result. With trembling hands, she held the bottle. He said that besides, they took all the money and believed something to say. The old man quoted his attacker as saying until he puts this creep behind bars, he won't rest. There was nothing to think about. Stitch guessed at once that it was about him. The old man warned his comrade to be careful here, but the guy ignored him, saying he would deal with it himself. Walking out of the tavern, the enraged seeker asked Dalton to send someone to Clyde's workshop just in case, and he'd take care of something in the meantime. All the way, the demon was concerned about his ward's condition, to which Stitch simply replied evasively. Of course, to destroy all undesirable people is not the way out, so he will just turn into an animal, but the boy could not leave this case just like that. Applying his animal sense, he began to track down the offenders with the skill to make it extremely easy. It didn't take long to realize where the bastard was. He was standing next to the guards, arguing hard. The enforcers politely apologized, but Dalton was a good citizen. Yes, and it's inconvenient to break in on him and for complaints at this late hour. Derek gritted his teeth and realized that there was no way to prove anything to these knuckleheads. There was nothing to do. He returned to his usual company where two companions were waiting for him, wondering what the guards had said. A man with a small beard and black hair asked why his friend was going out of his way for a measly 400 crowns. Derek replied in an angry voice that it wasn't about money at all. He didn't know who this newcomer was or what he was doing, but he had to catch him. Grinning, his comrade agreed, and suddenly felt someone's presence behind him. Stitch stood right behind them, drilling them with a fierce stare. For a while, all present were stunned with surprise. They were wondering how to find this boy, but he came to them. Stitch's voice sounded somehow monotonous. He hadn't beaten people up for a long time, but here, as they say, it was God's will. The white-haired brigand approached the boy and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. Without thinking long, Stick grabbed his opponent's hand, and on his finger, the ring was already burning. Before the bandit had time to think anything, he felt only a powerful blow and flew somewhere aside into the bushes. The boy stretched his arms and felt an unseen surge of strength. Now was just the perfect opportunity to stretch his fists. The two remaining men, Derek among them, were already preparing to attack, the black-haired man holding a shiny knife. Unfortunately, he couldn't use it as he was immediately hit in the face with a powerful knee strike. Immediately his nose broke, and the uncomprehending bandit also flew backwards. Derek, who had been watching all this time, also decided to rush to the attack. This degenerate was just a piece of meat for 400 crowns. With one deft move to block the blow, Stitch had already prepared his powerful fist. His speed was many times superior to these freaks. Derek suddenly felt a powerful blow to his jaw and immediately spat out several teeth. Gradually, Stitch began to come to a rage. One more blow, and here his opponent is already flying somewhere very far away. Trying to cling to the remnants of his thoughts, Derek wondered why they gave so little for this kid if he was so strong. Seeing his rival lying on the ground, Stitch ran up to him and poured Jivi to finally get him back on his feet, while Demon enjoyed the spectacle. Soon, there was a plate of flavorful pancakes and some other soup on the table with everything ready to eat. Dalton was wiping the cutlery and discussing the recent events of Derek wandering around the village like a bum this morning and what Stitch had done this time. Sweetly pulling up after a good night's sleep, the guy sighed, saying it was nothing special, he was just kneading his bones. Soon, the familiar voice of the dwarf armorer was heard, waving his hand in greeting as he not only repaired the tool, but also improved it. The weapon did look fresher at the end. The craftsman made a wedge-shaped tip for better efficiency and attached a wire on the inside. Dalton and Stitch squinted at the new weapon, something they doubted that this thing could be called a sword. Clyde sighed sadly and spoke about the gas capsules he had. Unfortunately, he could only get 4 of them. Since the guy said he was going to the dungeon, Dalton decided to give him a list of ingredients. If he showed it to an expert, he could give him some good advice. Besides, the bartender decided to ask around at the black market, so there would be no problem, and the dwarf marveled at how well the weapon fit Stitch. And indeed, everything looked great. Pleased with the updates, the guy thanked his old friends heartily. Clyde frowned and stopped his friend. If the Stitch had a new weapon, he had to name it something. Until that moment, not thinking about such things, the guy recovered, but suddenly heard the voice of the demon saying only one word, penetrator. Okay, so maybe let there be a penetrator lovingly inspecting the acquisition. The guy smiled broadly. Toward the gates of the great castle approached a procession of heralds, dispersed all warning that His Highness had returned. In the Kingdom of Venice, there was excitement in Brandon Castle. The young prince had returned, and everyone welcomed him. Harold sat in his seat and stared pensively in front of him. Apparently something was troubling him. A knock on the door was heard, and raising a weary look, the man allowed entrance. Alfred walked leisurely into the room, looking as haughty as ever. He got straight to the point and asked if he had made any progress. Harold lowered his gaze and said with a little hesitation that it was all quite good. Immediately noticing the hesitation, Alfred interrupted him to say that he didn't really think so. If you look at it from the outside, it's an unauthorized withdrawal from the Northern Front, and the withdrawal of one company. He was twiddling his thumbs, of which there were 3, and apparently it wasn't over yet. The most interesting thing about the artifact, as soon as it was mentioned, the herald darkened even more. Alfred said, without waiting for an answer, that during the audience, let his brother say nothing. He would arrange everything himself. Throwing an obscure bundle on the table, Alfred added, let Harold take it when he entered the royal hall. Soon, the audience began, and the herald was summoned to the royal hall. A man walked with a firm gait. Finding himself in front of the throne as befitted, he got down on one knee and gave a solemn salute. King Kintreus sat on his throne surrounded by his loyal servants. He had heard that the scion had been quite busy lately. As expected, Alfred took the floor and said that as soon as his brother heard the elf rebellion, he immediately rushed to help. Standing nearby, the first prince's assistant, Indril looked in the direction of the man with interest. Even she was hearing about such a thing. For the first time, it sounded strange. With complete certainty, Alfred stated it was only a matter of efficiency. His servant Conrad has an orb of divination. It was with the help of this item that they were able to locate the hotbed of rebellion and promptly suppress it. Had it not been for the herald's instant reaction, things would have turned out differently at that moment. The youngest son bowed and stood before the king. As soon as Indril heard about the artifacts, her expression immediately changed. With his gaze fixed in front of him, Alfred confirmed that it was for this reason that his brother had broken the ban. The king shook his head negatively, but he wondered how it all ended. Lowering his head even lower, Harold reported with sorrow in his voice that he had lost the entire company except for Belstock, but he had managed to destroy the artifact. The king was interested in this and asked again how the destruction had gone. The prince said that the artifact was contaminated, and the only true solution was to destroy it so that the infection would not spread further. Alfred added that his brother had brought the head of the elf leader as proof. After saying that, the younger prince took out the head his brother had prepared in advance. The king grimaced slightly at such a ghastly sight. However, he was glad that his youngest son had returned, so let him go to his room and rest. A smile spread across Alfred's face. There was one more thing not to forget. Now, the younger prince owed him a debt of gratitude, and he realized it himself, which made him even angrier. Meanwhile, Stitch and his guide decided to go fishing to clear his head, but the demon was as always dissatisfied with something. He grumbled that the fish looked like frog legs, but it looked quite appetizing and well fried. Stitch stuffed his mouth with tasty fish, and Memento had the vague thought that the farther west they traveled, the less traces of humans were visible. Most likely, it is because of the elves near the southwest. There is a forest in which the last largest settlement is located. But on the plus side, the demon was glad that now he could use his abilities without fear, and no one would say a word to you. Pouring water into his flask, Stitch noticed that it was too early to rejoice. Rumor has it that elves are very dangerous, so you should keep your eyes open and stay alert. An unidentified man was tearing through a thicket of woods and apparently trying to hide from someone. A few centimeters away from him, the arrow whistled and hit the ground, knocking him to the ground. While the poor guy was lying on the ground with his arms covered, he was already being followed by several silhouettes watching him intently. No sooner had the man gotten to his feet than he was surrounded by several strangers blocking his escape route. You could tell right away that they were elves by their distinctive ears and trademark clothing. The girl, apparently their leader, stopped her companions saying they would take him alive. The unsuspecting Stitch was moving deep into the dark forest and could not understand what was so mysterious about it. Touching his hand to the nearest tree, he couldn't find out any data about this place. Even the search engine was dumb. You couldn't even see the sky because of the tall bushes. And the map is useless, after all. It's not for nothing that this place is called the Dark Forest. His companion did not share such admiration, for they had a chance of getting lost for a long time, but Stitch was fully confident in his abilities. When they came out of the bushes, they saw a strange picture of a man tied to a board. The guy who came running up immediately gave the poor guy some water to drink so that he would finally wake up. The man was quite ill. Leaving him here in such a state was sheer sacrilege, but the demon was ordering him to get out of here immediately. The reason, of course, was river spirits. If Stitch wants to splash around with them, the demon won't get in the way. Looking closer, Stitch noticed that there were human remains in the river, and it looked as strange as possible. The place didn't inspire any confidence. So the best thing to do is to destroy these creatures before it's too late. The air bullet flew straight into the river spirits with tremendous speed, cutting them to pieces. Through the vacated passage, continuing to hold the poor man on his shoulders, Stitch ran as fast as he could. After a few seconds, spirits again formed at this spot, wanting new prey. Clearly, if these things are made of water, they can't survive an air attack. But if so, there's another way he activated the amulet by dipping his hand in the water. An electric wave immediately spread throughout the water, vaporizing all living things. The reaction of the river monsters was immediate. They began to wriggle, and the air was filled with screams. It was time to devour the curses once these things had already been destroyed. When the monsters were finished, Stitch sat down to rest a little. He wandered into a deep thicket and hoped that no one can find him here. The stranger, who woke up at this time, began to turn his head in different directions in an attempt to understand where he was. His savior looked at him with an annoyed look. For starters, the stranger should have calmed down a bit and tried to explain what happened and why he was tied up. The man, frightened to death, looked at his savior with huge eyes and begged him not to say that the boy didn't know about this dark forest. From everything it seemed that it was the work of the elves living here, but there was only one question: why the man came to such a dangerous place. According to the stories of the rescued man, it appeared that they were on their way to the capital with a shipment, but on the way, they came across these vile forest creatures. So the remains of those people were once their companions, right? The stranger covered his face with his hands and theatrically began to whimper, shaking with grief. Trying to get to the village logical was only one option Stitch offered: to take the man to the road, and then he will go on his own. Hearing this, the hitherto weeping man glowed with joy. For such a thing, he would be indebted to him all his life. If that's it, it's time to move out. Stitch activated his animal instincts as he sensed something wrong as soon as he entered this forest. It only took a few minutes for the boy to find the source of the sound, so it's time to move on. Their conversation revealed that the poor guy in trouble was named Peterson. They stopped on a small cliff, and Stitch, pointing his finger forward, advised his new acquaintance to follow that path, to which Peterson scattered in gratitude. Having just been rescued, he rejoiced because he was alive, but the stoic, as well as his demon, noticed something strange. He hurriedly drew his sword, and as soon as Peterson saw this, he immediately turned cold with fear. His joy was immediately replaced by animal fear and the realization of the nearness of his demise. But everything was exactly the opposite. The sword soared through the air and reflected the arrow flying straight at them, which flew in the other direction with a crackle. Fury immediately filled the traveler's eyes, and with a growling voice, he ordered the strangers out. It did not take long to persuade them from the forest. Thicket appeared several elves in front of a beautiful, statuesque girl, and they demanded to give the man to them. Gritting his teeth, Stitch wondered what would happen if he refused. The two elves looked at each other, apparently not expecting such insolence from a stranger. The elf girl, warned that she wasn't going to repeat herself twice, drew the bowstring and took aim. Not intending to give in, the stoic drew his sword, as if they didn't fully understand him. If they wanted to attack, let them do it now. The voice of a demonic companion sounded in his head, reminding him that if it wasn't for him, the guy would never have done such a thing in his life. The hooded elf asked the main what to do with this guy, but the girl silently only continued to draw the bowstring. She finally lowered her weapon, realizing that talking would solve the problem much easier in this case. It was slightly unexpected, and Stitch didn't realize the fight wasn't going to happen the first time. Surprised at this behavior of their superior, the other elves looked at her with surprised eyes, but Elena shook her head. With a single gesture, she ordered her companions to be quiet and took a few steps towards the stranger. Looking at Styx with a serious but calm gaze, the elfess asked if he knew the reason they were demanding the man's return. Surprised by this turn of events, Stitch asked for clarification. Peterson sensed that his defender seemed to be giving up ground and started tugging on his shoulder, but the guy said not to interrupt. Elena frowned, saying that before she started, she would like to know what the bastard had told him. Once the circumstances were clarified, the situation changed dramatically, and Peterson no longer felt so secure. Helena laughed heartily and invited them to come with him, and Stitch dragged Peterson along with him, though he struggled. A few minutes later, they arrived at the ransacked wagon the victim had mentioned. Stitch, not understanding anything, studied the scene and could not understand what was going on. Elena, noticing the boy's perplexity, approached the wagon and asked, didn't he get confused, and really there was a completely different direction. If they wanted to take cover, they should have gone deep into the woods, but the tracks lead in the opposite direction. That's for one thing. The elf's face became more welcoming. Each time they continued the dialogue, it was obvious that Peterson was getting more and more nervous and pouring cold sweat. Elena went straight down to the river, which caused quite a commotion, but she calmed the others down by saying that it was their territory and they were in no danger. The elven woman threw at Stitch's feet the very limb he had seen in the river, and this second, and Peterson, also called them his companions. All the people who were in the woods found the same bracelets that were on the victim's arms. I didn't have to think long. Stick was furious that this Peterson had deceived him so cleverly. Grasping the hand of the recently rescued man who had turned out to be a deceiver, the boy shouted that it was a slave trader's bracelet. Peterson tried to justify himself with his last strength, so why did he believe these sharp-eared men and not his own kin? He didn't have time to finish before he was hit in the face by a powerful blow that knocked out several teeth. It was useless to beg for mercy. You could see on Stitch's face that he was ready to smash the bastard to the ground. Stitch's voice sounded different now that this degenerate is so smart. He shouldn't have hidden the truth if he's ashamed to do it himself, so what's the point? Peterson was lying on the ground, trying to bring himself to his senses after such a powerful blow. He had far fewer teeth left in his mouth, and Stitch continued to rage, and the bastard dared to yell back. Elena, still in the same calm voice, asked how he would do and what he would say now. Stitch just turned in her direction and looked at her with a crazy look. The elfess noticed the stranger's fist clenching, and nothing good could be expected from such a thing. Peterson tried to come to his senses and was already smiling hysterically, realizing his near end. However, his sneaky nature couldn't end things so easily. The man snapped out of his seat and ducked. To Peterson's dismay, the arrow stabbed him in the back, piercing him through and through. The bastard started to stagger but still kept running. Elena took even better aim and prepared to shoot. The next arrow whistling through the air sliced straight into the man's ass, and it was not a pleasant sight. Stitch, who was watching, marveled at the marksmanship of the moving target. And in the most painful place at that time, she went to Peterson lying on the ground begging for mercy. He promises that if he's spared, he'll never catch her eye again. Plus, he promises to make amends. In desperation, the man has already asked for help from everyone, even the Stygian who almost took his jaw off. The criminal had no hope for help, but still begging, Elena pointed her bow at him, ready to fire. The arrow went through and fell into the river, leaving behind a drop of scarlet blood. The forest dweller wiped the arrowhead and couldn't help but wonder Stitch and the stranger were of the same race, and he didn't even move to help him. The stranger, still wary, said he was one of those who could not contain his anger. Blocking her attack would be a pretense or foolishness. Elena pointed her bow at him again. In that case, he understood exactly why she had to destroy any human caught here, Drain. Of course he did. Without waiting for an answer, she released the bowstring without the slightest hesitation. The tip came close to Stitch's face, but he was ready for it. He's not an ordinary traveler, so he shouldn't be written off. The arrow whizzed a few centimeters away without doing any damage. In one big leap, Elena moved away and got into a fighting stance. She was amazed that the guy didn't even move when the deadly arrow flew past him. Noticing the ominous energy around his body, she assumed he was a mage, though it was hard to tell at first glance. The elves began to talk to each other in a language of their own, incomprehensible to the others. Two of Elena's allies heard the order and instantly took off, disappearing into the thick of the forest. Sitting in the trees, they drew their bows prepared to destroy the enemy. Two bursting arrows flew straight at the Stoic, who saw everything perfectly. The crosswind worked just in time, pushing everything around them aside. The house elves were in shock and could not believe that there was any such powerful magic. In a completely calm voice, Stitch asked if they were counting on such an outcome of events, so why did they let him in on the details? Launching another arrow at the enemy, Elena answered, they only wanted to show that they do not destroy anyone without reason. The boy wanted to pull out his sword, but the demon warned him not to overdo it, or he'd already used most of his mana. The next blow, he also easily deflected the elven woman aiming for the head, so it is not difficult to predict. In principle, sitting and only defending herself is also stupid, but she will lose a leg or an arm if the Stitch attacks the demon corrected her. Having gathered his strength, Stitch directed a powerful beam of energy towards the enemy demon, involuntarily admired the resilience of his ward. The elf sitting somewhere in the bushes managed to bounce aside at the last moment. The guy immediately moved closer to another one and pointed his foot right in his face. It only took a second to reach the target. The sound of a powerful impact was heard. Elena couldn't believe that there was such power with an ordinary object. You can't use multiple types of magic. Maybe it's an artifact. That was the question she asked the boy, all but interest overcame her hatred. Without much enthusiasm, Stitch replied that he had gotten it himself. The elfess was horrified and immediately launched several arrows in his direction, but thankfully the boy got away in time. Just by looking at Elena's face, you can tell that she was filled with anger and ready to destroy anyone in her path. When asked what she was muttering, Memento laughed. She said that it was not a sin to launch a curse at such a head. Helena had not hesitated to get behind her victim's back and had already drawn the bowstring for a shot. The arrow whistled through the air and plunged straight into the unsuspecting Stitch's chest, causing severe pain. Jumping away from each other, they stood like that for a while longer. Their confrontation was just beginning. Even the recovery skill didn't immediately help heal the wounds, and the poor guy felt a severe pain in his chest. Elena's keen eye immediately saw that the boy was using some sort of witchcraft. The wound began to heal at an astonishing rate, and the arrow was out in a second. The next shot didn't take long, the arrow slicing through the air and moving toward its intended target. This time it managed to repel the attack with one sword stroke, and the Stitch managed to shatter the arrow. He thought he could resist the elves, but it turned out not to be so. Elena, meanwhile, marveled at the usefulness of the skill. The ringed fist came forward, ready to incinerate all living things in its path. The elven woman saw the danger she was in, and without delay fired several more arrows at the enemy. The slit of air did not even have time to work. As the arrow stabbed in a few centimeters from the Stitch, even the demon was puzzled how such a thing was possible. What kind of weapon is this? A simple arrow can't stop an attack this powerful. Everything turned out to be simple explosion of air forms a projectile, and if you hit it while it is not formed yet, the ability will be useless. In a split second, it is unrealistic to figure out one move at a time and hit the target directly. This elven woman was definitely not that easy, besides she was already aiming for her next shot. Any delay would be like death, so Stitch lunged forward, swinging his sword. The impact hit the ground, and shrapnel mixed with dust flew into the air. Elena covered her eyes from the dust and wondered if her rival still had anything left. Breaking up a cloud of dust, the Stitch moved for the next attack, while Elena was perplexed. With staggering speed, the arrow flew just a centimeter from his ear, even a little stunned, but the crosswind worked as needed. The distance between them was shrinking rapidly. At this proximity, the Elphus would easily be able to hit him. The amulet continued to blaze with green fire. Much to his surprise, his opponent didn't use magic attacks. His fist simply moved towards Elena's face. If she hadn't reacted in time, she would have been hit hard, but luckily she managed to jump aside. The next blow didn't take long for the Stitch to strike, determined to defeat her physically, if not with skill. Whatever maneuvers the elves have, they can't move through the air. He had already grabbed his opponent by the scruff of the neck. The boy's face was rapidly approaching Elena's, as if he intended to knock her out with a blow to the forehead. Barely opening her eyes, she saw Stitch's silhouette sitting a few meters away from her, talking to himself. It took a moment for her to come to her senses, and realize that she seemed to have lost the fight. Stitch, noticing the movement, turned his eyes toward where Elena was sitting. While the elves were out, the guy managed to tie them up, so they couldn't escape the first thing Elena asked, why he came to the forest. Despite his fears, he assured that he had not come here for the elves. He had no intention of fighting anyone. Getting to his feet and looking at his prisoners seriously, he added that he would have to pay for what they wanted to do to him. Realizing the deplorability of her situation, Elena simply lowered her eyes to the ground. Much to their disappointment, the guy just robbed them, taking all their supplies as compensation. Examining the interesting amulet, the winner said good-naturedly that he had treated them kindly. At first, he thought that he would not get out of this battle alive. Noticing the surprise on the captive's face, he asked what she was so surprised about. Unfolding the map in front of him, Stitch repeated that he only needed a dungeon, and it seemed there were 3 in this forest. He also decided to borrow the map for a while. If they met again, Stitch would return it. Not paying any attention to the guy's monologue, Elena shrieked for him to wait. Despite all the entreaties, the stoic stood firmly on his feet with a quick gait and waved goodbye, ignoring the shouts. On the way, he looked at the map, which turned out to be quite difficult to understand, but it was still possible to make sense of it. Without the use of a landmark, he'd only run circles around the place, but he'd finally made it to the right dungeon. It was very dark inside, and it was very difficult to see anything further than your nose. Everything here seemed very unusual, and my head was spinning in different directions looking at the surroundings. Everything in the cave was strange. There were trees of incredible size everywhere, and what was stranger was that they were growing underground. He tried to find the right path with the help of the search, but his experience in such dungeons was not enough for him. But animal instinct was even able to help a little by pointing in the right direction. Even the almighty demon who possessed incredible power was surprised by such a method. The question begged itself. Since when the boy goes to the dungeons? Stitch replied that since 12 years old. They went deeper and deeper. If one wants to do what one loves to do, one has to be resourceful. They continued to pound with the tip and moved deeper and deeper, and something should have appeared by now, but it was still empty. The demon's husky voice explained that the problem was always their language, which the boy couldn't help but agree with. Soon, a horrible sight came into view. Something very strange was growing right into a tree or trees, and it was a monster. It was Legos. If you lifted your head up, you could see that the roots of this tree were entangling everything around them. Worst of all, they perceived any living organism as an enemy. Despite the difficulty, Stitch didn't stop, for he was one of the few who hunted such creatures. With deft movement, he dodged most of the monster's attacks. With just one swing of his sword, he chopped down several of the vile growths at once. The monster was faster and took numbers, so soon the roots caught up with the poor man and encircled his entire body. Instantly, they began to grow into his skin, causing intense pain. It was almost unrealistic to get out of this trap. One more second, and everything would end badly. It was getting harder and harder to breathe, the roots coming closer and closer, squeezing my throat. A powerful stream of air was able to coax the guy out of that grip of rifting nasty wood, after all. At the demon's indignation, Stitch examined the wounded arm, but it wasn't that serious. Offended by the nickname, Beef Stitch threatened to kill him when he hesitated. So simply this tree cannot be defeated. In such a case, it is necessary to burn it, which the guy did by launching his fire jet into it. No matter what anyone said, but the effect of this spell was amazing. The only thing left of the tree were the embers. Now all you have to do is absorb the cursed energy and feed the demon. A jet of smoke erupted from the entrance to the dungeon and burned this tree to the ground. After the cloud, the culprit of the celebration appeared from the cave and flew out of there like a bullet. Now everything was clear. All that was left was to bring herself to her senses and get some breathing room, plus the magical powers of the artifacts had increased. Now it would be possible to deal with the ability, which the guy did at that moment, but to his surprise, the magic power was still lacking. Interrupting his interest, a familiar silhouette appeared behind him and landed almost silently. Just in time to notice this, Stitch turned around and put his sword to the throat of the intruder. But Elena didn't seem to be hostile. She even said she didn't come here to fight. The boy exhaled, but wondered then why she came here. Could it really be because of the map? The girl blushed and sat on her knees. He could take anything he wanted, but he had to give back one thing, namely the medallion. Pulling the busy artifact out of his pocket, the guy scrutinized it and what was wrong with it. It seemed to be too expensive for the elf, and as soon as she saw the cherished thing, she cried out, but soon other voices were heard. 2 elves. Apparently her kin landed next to her and began to swivel their heads. Before they could even say a word, one of them immediately received a powerful punch to the stomach. The next one suffered the same fate. Her breath hitched. Despite her appearance, Elena was an extremely strong elf. The elves didn't understand why their mistress was acting so strangely. They had come to save her. To be fair, Stitch hadn't expected this turn of events herself. She'd now taken to beating up her friends. Memento, who was already excited about the new fight, suddenly faltered and opened his mouth in surprise. What is even going on here? Elena fell to her knees and kept begging for that medallion back. She even said she would do anything. And why would she say that? How do you know what Stitch would want from her? And if he turns out to be a villain? She didn't seem to doubt that if Stitch says so, it's hard to call him a villain. And Stitch kept that man alive. Despite what he's done, he's a far cry from the villain. It was hard to argue with that. Let's just say that the Stoic had continued to examine the medallion all this time. But why was it so important to her? When he saw that Elena was embarrassed, he left it at that. Since she cared so much about the thing, he'd give it back. Approaching her closely, Stitch clarified that he had one condition. Closing her eyes and sighing heavily, the elfess agreed. She said she would do anything. We need to destroy all the dungeons in this forest. Stitch's voice sounded completely calm. Already ready to agree, Elena suddenly opened her eyes in surprise, not believing her own ears. The guy's look said he wasn't lying, and when he got to the end, he'd give up the medallion. You can say anything you want, that she's escorting a criminal, that he's her slave, whatever comes up on the street. Elena listened to all this with wide-open eyes of amazement and could not believe her ears, but still agreed. The note she left for the others said that Elena had gone on a scouting trip and would be gone for a few days. The forest was her home from birth, and her grandmother who raised her told her many stories. Including the ones in my memory were the ones that talked about people. According to her, they were greedy creatures, ready to commit any atrocity for the sake of wealth. But despite all the warnings, the man she had just met was very different. Besides the evil sides, he showed good deeds that didn't fit her understanding. Walking a little deeper into the forest, it was getting hard to breathe. The demon continued to banter about the naive friendship between the two unfamiliar races. Stitch decided to start the conversation by apologizing for dragging her along, to which the pixie replied that he was definitely not a good one. She still couldn't understand why he was so eager to conquer the dungeons. If it was all about artifacts, then why in this forest? He sighed heavily and slapped himself in the face, perhaps to someone else he could tell. The blue lantern in Elena's hands continued to illuminate the path with a bluish light. Soon, they had to go down into the dungeon. The entrance was securely hidden, so the passersby couldn't just get in. Going down, Stitch couldn't help but marvel at the variety of different dungeons. His musings didn't last long, for a monster crawled out of the ground a few centimeters away from him. At the last moment, it managed to react, and the sword managed to protect its owner. Having dealt with the monster, Stitch asked his companion if she was all right. With a serious look at him, Elena advised him to be careful. In front of her stood a giant ant about 10 times larger than herself and snapped its dangerous claws. Opening its stinking maw, the monster lunged at her with the intent to devour her. Without much effort, Elena jumped up, swinging her weapon. It took a few short blows to bring down the monster. Another giant ant was already approaching from the other side, and by the way, it was different from the previous one in color and size. Stitch was just in time, and with one mighty kick of his foot, he tossed the insect aside. With a nasty squawk, the ant rose to his feet, and behind him were already several pairs of red eyes. Ordering them to stay behind, Stitch prepared a fireball to burn the monsters before there were more of them. The fire spread with incredible speed, consuming the monsters one by one. Elena's eyes widened in surprise at the magic she'd witnessed for the first time since he'd fought her. Finished dealing with the monsters, Stitch felt a strange smell different from the usual smell of fire. But Elena wondered how many skills could be used thanks to this artifact, to which Stitch answered not less than 10. Wondering what was the point of giving up their lives like that, the ants just threw themselves into the fire to keep it from spreading deep into the dungeon. Stitch poked the body of one of the monsters with his foot too late to say it, but Elena said the dungeon was called Small Bing. Most of the ants around here have tough armor. Stitch noticed that. Seeing the artifact devouring the curse, the elven woman shuddered slightly and wondered if all artifacts had such properties. It was quite possible that she wouldn't believe him. It was amusing to watch the girl unable to take her eyes off what was happening. Looking resentfully at the Stitch, Elena noticed that controlling magic was different from controlling energy. Using magic, Stitch grasps a much deeper essence. Looking at his ring, the boy replied that the artifact was a monster, capable of manifesting magic, and that it could not harm a human being. Elena repeated the last phrase in a whisper, glancing at her companion with a wary look. Quickly she turned around and went deep into the dungeon. The demon asked him what he thought about what she was thinking, to which Stitch shook his head. When asked if he could be trusted, the demon said that there was no choice, which was logical. They'd gone deeper and deeper, and it was very confusing, which is why the elves don't come here. After striking the wall several times with his sword, the stoic used his beastly instincts. Something seemed strange to him as soon as he began to explore the depths of the dungeon. It turned out that there were more ants than expected, and they were moving straight towards the uninvited guests in an endless stream. The dungeon they were in had a very complex system, far more complicated than any they had ever encountered. It was showing too much movement to build an accurate pattern. Elena, who started to speak, reminded that this dungeon was very complicated, and it was almost impossible to find the main one by normal means. Suddenly, the pixie's keen hearing caught a strange movement Elena immediately ordered to hide. The elven girl grabbed him by the neck and pressed him to the earth, which was unexpected. Covering herself and the boy with the cloak, she ordered him not to move. In front of them stood an enormous-sized ant, holding a cocoon with its claws, but luckily, the monster could see nothing. Memento reported, "It seems these insects saw the ashes and began moving their pupae to a safe place." The artifact tried to give the boy the right idea. This dungeon has a complex hierarchy with the womb at the top and the next on the list. It seems the artifact's head has started working again, so he suggests finding the location of the mate with the help of the porter ants. The artifact started thinking clearly again and suggested they use it as soon as they saw the ants. It was a good idea, but this dungeon wasn't created yesterday. Even the elves couldn't track such a complex system. The demon grinned. Easy to say the passages leading to the guards are full of ants, as a dozen elves to cope with them all the time. Stitch was talking to the invisible man. Memento tried to reassure his ward by saying that he had a thought on the matter. Let the guy just act. And that's it. There was an explosion that shook the entire dungeon with incredible force. The fireball worked perfectly, sizzling all life in its path, and the camouflage cloak hid them from the gaze of the monsters. If the demon was talking about this method, that's great, but it's still a long way off. One swing of the weapon was enough to have an ant in two. Helena was a good shot, and each arrow hit its target. This was followed by a fire wave that sizzled all living things in its path, a method that was idiotic, but worked. There were a lot of them. With Elena's skill to make a fuss, and then look for a quiet place, was certainly a strange decision. Animal instinct spread out, showing the right path. Stitch sensed something, as if someone's presence was near, and immediately looked into the dark recess of the cave. They had almost reached the end of the line, but Elena looked worriedly at some amulet. Trying to touch the elven girl, received an electric shock, and in addition, the color of the amulet changed. It was made by the hands of elves. Most likely the things belonged to the rest of who was here, but it was impossible in such a state to give things to loved ones. Memento appeared out of nowhere and offered to take the items for himself. Since they were useless to the elves, these things would be useful for aura curses. It's a sound idea, but would an elf allow a mere human to take a thing that belonged to other elves? It was still worth a try, but Stitch asked politely to take the artifacts away since no one wanted them. Elena didn't immediately understand the question. The girl raised an eyebrow in surprise, but if he touched such objects, he might as well kiss his life goodbye, or at best, be unlucky. Despite all the warnings, Stitch smiled and said he was being guarded by an artifact, so she couldn't figure out what he was up to. But if there are no problems, let him do what he wants with enviable speed. The boy approached the artifacts. Much to Elena's surprise, he put the cursed artifacts on himself without much harm, and even smiled. Moving deeper, they entered the room, and the monster in the middle was probably the keeper of the place. In front of them stood a huge ant, much larger than any they had seen before. His muzzle was even more menacing, and his huge claws didn't bode well. The frightened Elena drew the bowstring of her bow. They need not delay right. The arrow in her hands trembled. Even such an accurate shot was useless against the monster. The arrow simply bounced off the hard shell. There was a pause for a few seconds, but suddenly more ants began to hatch from the eggs lying nearby. There was a cracking sound, and the shell began to break, and sharp paws pierced through it. It did look disgusting. It's also dangerous if you hesitate any longer. With sharp hearing, Elena heard another huge pack approaching from behind. Dozens of ants crawled out of every possible opening, with a nasty crackling sound. Rather, it was necessary to stop all of this, or the situation would be dire. A jet of fire flew forward, scorching everything around him. The ants' skin began to crack even. Their powerful carapace couldn't withstand such a temperature. The group of monsters looked at the Stitch with a clear desire to kill the troublemaker, but the demon was jubilant and already had a plan in mind. Elena shouted that she would deal with the others, but she didn't have time to finish her sentence. Her companion pointed the ring directly at the pile of ants, ordering her to step back. The air current shattered a nearby rock and collapsed the vault right onto the ants. It was decided giving up the cursed bracelet for a new ability would be a good plan. In essence, cursed items are ordinary things that have been lying in an abandoned place for a long time and have been infused with cursed energy. As a result, they deal damage to anyone who touches them, so except for researchers, no one risks picking them up. The power of the artifact on the Stitch's finger easily suppresses the curse, and so the items can be worn. But the curse aura weakens everything around it. It's really a two-pronged stick, but it doesn't matter now. Ordered to stand aside, the guy clutched the cursed object in his hands, absorbing its aura. As soon as he did so, a wave of cursed energy flew in different directions, dealing enormous damage. It was a great effort to stay on his feet. The power was disproportionate to what had been felt until now. Even the seemingly experienced researcher had a hard time, and what power did this skill unleash? He did everything right. Memento confirmed aura. Curse is exactly how it works. Now let the elf do the rest. With a great effort in a weak voice, Stitch called out to Elena, and the elfess seemed to wake up from her dream. In a gradually weakening voice, he ordered her to destroy the queen, or it would become difficult to contain her. Elena realized it all at once. Taking 2 arrows at once, the girl took good aim at this payment for the monsters eating her brothers. The arrows went through even the hard shell of the antmate couldn't protect her from the damage. The ant soldiers didn't even immediately realize what was happening, and started making a hideous cracking sound. A whole pack was already approaching the guys from behind, eager to deal with those who had disturbed their peace. With a final tug, the Stitch ordered the girl to cover her ears and stand still. The electric arc went off, just as it should. Clots of green lightning flew in different directions with a deafening crackle. Now it was possible to eat all the curses. A smile appeared on the traveler's face by itself. Soon it was all over, and by the way, Elena had never seen such a reckless man as Stitch was. It was useless to make excuses. The limit of the magic artifact increased as a consequence of the curse devouring level increased. It was time to leave. The dungeon had been cleared and Stitch clutched the escape scroll in his hands. For the next 3 days, they did nothing but clear out dungeons one by one. The last one, I think, was called Mahogany. Smiling Stitch looked at his demonic companion and reassured him he wasn't that tired. The demon didn't seem to share his enthusiasm. But that wasn't the point at all. Elena added that it was the elves that were the danger, which was surprising. The thing was that this dungeon was right next to their settlement. It would be hard to sneak past the elves without being noticed. Suddenly, the girl interrupted her story by blocking the road with her hand, which was a little strange. There was a strange trail on the ground, probably left by a deer, but Elena couldn't say for sure. The trail was similar, but it actually belonged to the Striders. This phrase stumped the guy. Elena explained that this is the name of the scout elves, among which only the most elite are equal to them. It was embarrassing to admit it, but Stitch had never heard of such creatures. If they were so remarkable, people must know about them. Elena's gaze changed. Striders never leave alive those who learned of their existence. After that, a chill ran down the back of even a seasoned traveler's spine. Elena continued, if those elves attacked out in the open, Stitch might win, but if they managed to sneak up on us, they'd send everyone to their deaths. After such a gruesome story, silence fell briefly between them, but Elena stopped again, looking around. The strange thing was that even her keen hearing couldn't pick up the sounds of animals nearby. Even powerful animal instincts failed to recognize any sounds nearby. It was obvious to a fool that they were being hunted. Elena tried to track the location of the stalkers, activating the hostility detection skill. The girl scanned the area around her. To her horror, she noticed it wasn't hostility. It was a desire to destroy. Elena's loud shout cut through the silence. The girl was obviously scared to death. The arrow flew that it was impossible to notice it. Stitch was hit in the shoulder in a second and fell to the ground. From the nearest bushes, they were already being followed by 2 pairs of eyes, scrutinizing their every move. The poor guy was seriously injured, and as he lay unconscious, Elena tried unsuccessfully to shake him awake. Another arrow whistled nearby and stuck into the ground. 2 elves finally came out of the shadows and greeted Elena. There was a man and another girl. The male elf's name was Chester. Elena immediately screamed what they were up to in a voice of anger, and fear could be heard. An elf girl named Ada asked in a gruff voice if Elena was in a position to ask questions right now, but Chester calmed her down. Despite the expression on Helena's face, Ada was adamant. How dare she bring the man to them? Without much thought, Ada drew the bowstring, but her gaze caught on something strange. Much to Elena's surprise, she shielded her wounded comrade with her body without letting her touch him. This person only needed to walk to the redwood tree. The girl was trying her best to change the minds of her fellow humans. Chester noticed the medallion lying in his bag all this time, which confused him. Maybe what Elena said was true, but the keeper had been robbed of the relic. Chester noticed that Helena had also been a strider once, a look of obvious fear on her face. Not wanting to stall any longer, Ida said that they would, of course, hear all the excuses at the meeting. Soon the elven village was buzzing with excitement as the meeting was about to begin. Despite Helena's frown, Chester was in a good mood and was carrying the still passed out sticks on his shoulder. He wondered what kind of man he was, who had lost so much blood but was still alive. Elena turned around and looked at him with a sizzling gaze. If they only knew how valuable he was, they wouldn't treat him that way. Soon they approached the elder, a young-looking elfess with long white hair. She immediately praised the Striders for a good job. Beside that, she said hello with some obvious disdain to Elena, who lowered her head. In response to the greeting, Elena just remained silent with her eyes closed. Besides, the elder wondered who the man they'd brought in was. Squinting his eyes, Chester said with disgust, "This man, in addition to stealing, dared to threaten the keeper. They caught him near the village." After these words, the village leader wondered a little how this man was still alive. To be honest, they didn't know it was extremely difficult to survive after such wounds, but the boy had somehow regenerated. Then the elder said to stop the blood and throw him in the dungeon about the punishment they would think about later, and Elena was to follow her. Obediently lowering her head, Elena obeyed her command. Soon they found themselves in a spacious and cozy room, more like a living corner. The elder's voice was worried. The redwood dungeon had reached a level that it was difficult to contain. How much it had grown, one could only guess. The spirit is about to go beyond the dungeon. Just a few days ago, several villagers were kidnapped. That place looked more like a living thing, seeking to spread. There was less and less time left to secure the village. Even in spite of such a difficult situation, Elena was still able to allow a man to enter their domain, endangering everyone. The frightened girl wanted to object, but the elder interrupted her and said that her colleagues would no longer turn a blind eye to such arbitrariness. Memento tried unsuccessfully to wake his comrade, who still lay unconscious. Eventually, Stitch came to his senses, but his head was still splitting. I didn't immediately realize where it was, but soon it became clear that it was some kind of arena with screaming elves everywhere. Seeing that the boy had come to his senses, the demon rushed to explain to him, so let him listen carefully. Briefly, Stitch was injured. Now he's being dragged to the elf village and tried for trespassing. Calling for silence, the elder rose from her seat and asked the accused after entering their territory they had stolen the relic. Was wondering still what happened to Elena, the boy was in no hurry to answer the question. The demon pointed to a girl standing on the edge to the right, who seemed to be treated no better than a stranger. It seems the very medallion that Stitch misappropriated was the very relic he had to admit his guilt. After his confession, the bleachers fell quiet as tension slowly began to rise. It had finally dawned on him that this seemingly inconspicuous thing was incredibly important, not only to Elena. The elder continued, then Stitch used that as an excuse to drag Elena after him into the damn forest. All I had to do was nod my head and admit it was all pure truth. The next question is whether he wanted to enslave his fellow man, or for what purpose he entered the forest and did so. After a little thought, Stitch answered his goal is only to defeat all the dungeons in the forest. This question stumped even Chester and Ada. Elena just closed her eyes, trembling with fear, unable to do anything. In that case, the elder demanded to know the number of troops here. In addition to this supply and expedition plan, Stitch, not expecting such a thing, just flapped his eyes, trying to understand what was going on. They were one and the same, with the demon asking, where did all this come from? After such a turn of events, the elder hesitated half a word, and a whisper spread through the stands. No one believed that the guy could defeat the dungeon alone. Chester jumped down as if he were a flake. It was obvious that he had little faith in the story because you have to lie depending on the situation. His eyes changed. Theirs seemed to be covered with a white veil. It looked threatening. It was hard to see where this was going, but Stitch tensed with a premonition of something bad. His senses didn't fail in a second. Shortening the distance, Chester delivered a powerful punch, right in the belly of the unfortunate. With people, you have to behave according to their rules. Stitch, who hadn't expected such a despicable act, clutched his stomach, and his whole body felt like it was on fire. Deciding to leave things as they were, the elder did not interfere in their squabbles. Looking at Elena with a firm gaze, the woman decided to proceed with the interrogation of her accomplice. The beating of poor Stitch continued. No one even thought to come to his aid, and Elena just couldn't do anything. Trying to match her expression, the girl replied that if the stranger's goal was to destroy the dungeon, it could help the elves. She didn't know if it was a bluff or not, but it was true that he had single-handedly cleared 2 dungeons. She had witnessed it herself. The elder had little faith in this. For to do such a thing, one must be trained at least at the military level. The fight continued. Stitch could do nothing, for his hands were tied. He was now a punching bag. There was less and less strength left to hold back, and he wanted to give his attacker a good thrashing, but he couldn't do that yet. Elena tried to prove this man had no troops, no supplies, and the 2 of them did it all together. The clan leader still couldn't understand what had happened to her and why she was covering for this outsider. Helena, who had already given up all hope, said there was no point, she was just telling it like it is. But then she was distracted by Ida's voice, and the defendant interrupted half-heartedly. With obvious concern on her face, Ada turned to the main one with a look of fear on her face. The other elves also fussed. Something very strange began to happen. Finally, tired of putting up with all this bullying, Stitch began to transform before his eyes. If they want to see the human way, then so be it. Maybe it would be better to try fighting for 2 days non-stop, then it would at least be fun. Chester continued to smirk because he had the advantage, and this opponent couldn't even respond. Elena got worried. The elder had said that this was the limit, if this man. And there was a way to solve the problem, then maybe that was it. She brought someone who could absorb the monster and the dungeon's fighting spirit. The pitiful spectacle of beating his ward made even the demon revolt to wonder if he was missing too many blows. But it was within the norm. If Stitch is going to make a mess here, it's not going to play into his hands. The judge still couldn't believe what Elena was saying. It sounded so delusional that she didn't even want to hear it. Suddenly turning to the elder, Ada asked her to release that monster. The rest of the elves, just hearing about it, had already started to look amongst themselves with obvious excitement. If Elena was telling the truth, then they would check it out now. Ida's words sounded without a single doubt, and Elena didn't seem to mind either. Chester was ordered to stop, and the elf immediately removed his hands theatrically, showing that he was surrendering. To stick his surprise, he could not understand what these elves were up to, but it seemed to be a new challenge. The tight rope was starting to make my arms ache, but that wasn't the main problem right now. As soon as the cage opened outward, an incredible-sized creature covered in fur appeared. It was an armored bear. It was not known until now that anyone had been able to tame this monster to the point that it was threatening, to say the least. Even the elven girl was a little afraid. If it was too much for a stranger, Ada shook her head. If Elena was telling the truth, the human could easily handle him. With a glance at the battlefield, the elder turned to the stranger, let him now demonstrate his abilities. It seems that there was no other choice. With bitterness, Stitch thought that he would have to show his abilities, but he was unarmed. Noticing that he didn't have his usual talisman on his finger, the boy wondered how he was able to talk to it. To his surprise, the demon was able to hide so as not to loom in front of his eyes. It was unclear what strategy to choose best, of course to run away, but unfortunately, there was no such option. And not expecting any of this, the bear swung his huge paw in an attempt to fight back. Even with all the power of the spell, the bear was unharmed, but his fur was still a bit burnt. Next in line was a blast of air. A powerful airstream flew straight at the monster. But even that trick didn't work. The air just shattered, hitting the hard armor of the bear. The elves standing in the stands were horrified by the spells used by the simple stranger. The armored monster, annoyed at the, shook his head, trying to throw himself off the obsession. His eyes widened at the fact that he couldn't take it, and moreover, it only made him angrier. A huge, clawed paw flew up, and the only thing left to do was to run away so as not to say goodbye to life. Thank God the guy had enough speed to get out of the line of attack, but after such a blow, even the earth under his feet began to tremble. The last method was to arc the bear with a powerful volley, depriving it of the ability to move. Shocked, Ida wondered how this was possible, like Chester had given him magic items or something, but the guy denied it was just nonsense. This spell seems to have worked. The bear was emitting smoke. Even its thick armor could not withstand such power. The elder, along with her entourage, only stared in amazement at what was happening in her long century. It was the first time she had seen something like this. A slight smile appeared on Elena's face inside. She was glad that her new acquaintances were able to endure after all. The bear was already looking shabby, but the powerful volley of spells still managed to do significant damage. The resentful demon began to grumble. He had already spent almost all of his arsenal, just a little bit more, and there would be no energy left at all. Luckily, this monster is affected by lightning. If so, the guy can take him down. He rushed forward to attack. The bear became enraged, and with a roar started waving his paws, trying to catch the annoying boy who came closer and closer. His attacks were much slower now, and Stitch was already dodging them with ease. Once behind him, the guy jumped up, aiming for the weak spot. In his hands, a fireball glistened, ready to unleash its full power on the bear any minute now. A moment later, a fire jet flew into the monster's head, and it was hard to believe that it could survive after such a thing. By some miracle, the surviving bear opened his mouth and roared with rage. Seizing the moment, Stitch grasped his long tongue and pulled on it. He was sitting on the monster's head. It seemed the advantage was now on his side. It was time to see how strong it was. From the inside out, the boy's arm was covered in electric shocks. One powerful volley was enough to bring the bear down. Now all that was left was to gather the cursed energy. Sitting in the stands, Ida and Chester opened their eyes in amazement for the first time in their lives. They had seen something like this. Someone was able to defeat an armored bear. Elder Paris was horrified. In his long life, he had never seen anything like this man violated all the laws of the natural world. The Elfess interrupted his tantrum by ordering him to stop talking nonsense. Do they have any choice? If they let him go, their only chance of salvation will evaporate. Covering her face with her hand in shame, the Elfess apologized to Elena for her mistrust. Elena didn't seem to be particularly upset, but what are they going to do now? Still, with some doubt, the kin replied that the only thing left to do was to trust this strange stranger. Asked what his name was, Stitch introduced himself and looked up at the elders. The clan leader's face still looked serious. Yes, he had proved his strength, but there was one question: why he had taken the relic from Elena after all. Without the slightest hesitation, the guy replied that he didn't even know it was a relic, and he had no intention of appropriating it for himself. It seems that this answer satisfied the girl. If the main goal of the stranger is to destroy the red tree, then they have no right to interfere, but they can't help either. The pesky demon again appeared nearby, saying that the guy didn't seem to like them at all. As soon as Elena said she would go with him, the elf objected, to which the girl only looked at her. Surprised, such a dungeon, it is his level after all. No matter how strong he was, it was sacrilege to send him there, but the elder was adamant she would have to pay for her transgression. It was useless to argue with that, but Skull was still surprised that this race was even more closed than the dwarves. In answer to all objections, Stitch said he would no longer stand by and watch everything. She seems to have forgotten what Stitch told her a while ago. She still didn't understand anything, but the stranger made it clear he seemed to be saying that each time he cleared the dungeon, his power increased. With some displeasure, the elder still ordered Chester to give the stranger his belongings, adding, "If he might need anything else, let him speak." Looking at her in response, Stitch said a couple zealous and he could use one in that case. Let her go right now. At this time, in the thick of the forest, a group of elves continued to fight the spreading monster from the dungeon. The squad leader ordered to block this monster to prevent it from spreading any further. A flurry of arrows whistled, cutting through the vile tentacles. The reinforcements were still not there to everyone's horror. Several hideous growths were already flying at the general. General Nazir was unable to react in time and was immediately grabbed by the tentacles, rendering him motionless. Without wasting time, the monster shoved several of its outgrowths under his skin, beginning to siphon off his life energy. A fireball appeared out of nowhere and immediately incinerated the hellspawn. Smiles blossomed on the faces of the elves. At last, the reinforcements came they had not hoped for. But when they saw who helped them, the joy immediately left them. It was a man, the same stranger, with a disgruntled Chester walking beside him. General Nazir, finally freed from captivity, wondered what a man was doing here in such a thicket. In addition, Ida warned that anyone who touched this stranger would instantly lose his arms and legs, which caused considerable surprise among the elves. The general, who was helped by Chester, could not understand now the Striders were guarding the people. And besides, what kind of magic was this? There was no answer to these questions. Still with a great deal of distrust in his voice, Chester said that according to the elder, this fellow was their last hope. Finished with the monsters, Stitch waved his hand and went into the depths of the dungeon. Being in the house of the elder, Elena still could not understand why she stopped her. By the way, this elf woman was Elena's grandmother. Lowering her eyes, the elfess clarified that she wasn't crazy to send her granddaughter to such a dangerous place. She has lost many family members in this cursed place so that her only granddaughter will not suffer such a fate. If there is no one left to guard the entrance to the dungeon, then the elven clan will be finished. If we use an outsider, it would be better to send reinforcements. With much doubt in the voice, Grandma asked Elena if she was perfect for the role. Smacking herself on the forehead, the wise elf sighed. No need to kid herself. Elena's father was gone. Even if she went right now, he wouldn't come back. Elena's lips quivered, as her grandmother said it was an obsession, but the elder's voice stopped the argument. With a quick gait, the elder entered the room, saying that they would be prepared for the worst, especially in this position. No matter how strong this outsider is, if he is defeated, then hope is gone. They must have a second plan. After saying that, everyone in the room tensed up, and the elder said that this time she would go there personally. Even if she doesn't have the same skills that Elena's father Cain has, at least she will bring peace and tranquility to the elves for a while. Bones crunched underfoot, making a nasty sound. The inside of the cave was even worse than Stitch had supposed it to be, and the odor was unbearable. Stitch looked back and noticed strange plants on the walls, but the demon had no such plants in his memory. Preventing his ward's curiosity, the demon ordered him to keep his hands off of those little flowers. Better find a way to get through the dungeon. If things get weird here, the boy will just collapse unconscious, and then they'll never get out of here. It was hard to argue with this. By the way, Stitch was not particularly eager to linger here either, so as soon as possible applied the wayfinding. After a while, they stopped. The demon wondered if they had already come. He had thought he would have to go through all 9 circles of hell. But still there was no desire to move forward. There was something even stranger ahead. If the roots had gone this far, there must be water under the ground. Stitch immediately thrust his sword into the tangle of nasty roots. A rumbling sound was heard, and the ground beneath my feet began to shake, gradually failing. Soon, there was a funnel through which the adventurer fell through to the next floor. Turns out they haven't gotten there yet. There's a lot more down here. There was really a lot to see here, with strange plants growing everywhere that looked like flower boxes, and a small stream of green water. The guess as to what this place was came by itself, but it didn't make it any easier. One of these boxes contained a body almost completely dried up, seemingly drained of all energy. Stitch, who was trying to study the contents, didn't even notice that several outgrowths were already moving toward him from the back. It was only at the last moment that he sensed something and instinctively turned around to chop a few tentacles. The next moment, several more of the same hideous outgrowths were moving at him. It wasn't hard to take them down. Worst of all these people seemed to be lifeless. At last, one of the unfortunates did come to his senses, and the traveler hurried to find out what this place was. The elf who had just come to his senses was frightened, tears streaming down his cheeks, and it turned out that this was a mahogany dungeon with no way out. The poor man received a powerful slap that brought him to his senses. Because of this behavior, Stitch was extremely annoyed and ordered to get a grip on himself. All is well now. He handed the rescued man a scroll of return, advising him to use it when the others woke up. The elf still couldn't understand anything. The boy was about to go on as the elf he had saved yanked his cloak, stopping him. There was more rescuing to be done. The uncomprehending Stitch said he'd already saved everyone. But it turns out there was one more. It was clear from the elf's face that he wasn't lying. It was because of that last one that everyone else was still alive. He was talking about Cain. At this time, the man was in a pitiful state with several outgrowths sucking the life out of his body into his face. They drew too much energy out of him, but luckily the man was still alive by some miracle. Being in his confinement with the remnants of his hearing, he managed to hear that someone had broken through the wall and was nearby. It wasn't hard to guess that it was Stitch now he was holding the rescued elf on his back, because he couldn't walk properly yet. As soon as they saw the horrible picture, the elf cried out, and goosebumps ran down his back. In one big jump, covering the distance, Stitch warned that it would hurt a bit, so it was better to clench your teeth harder. The kid he saved was horrified. You could have been a little more polite. It was their supervisor after all. The elf didn't even have time to realize that the commander was barely alive on his back and needed to be healed. The elf thanked the boy for the scroll and for keeping him alive. He and the demon turned over Stitch seemed to get it right. It was the same drainer Elena was talking about. It was doubtful to let this wretch go alone, but if no one attacked him, he might get out of here alive. That's not what matters now. Behind this wall, Stitch sensed the master of this dungeon all the while the monster was drilling him with his gaze. With a blast of air, a hole appeared in the wall through which he entered the next room. In front of them was a sight so disgusting that it was hard to hold back the vomit. It was the dungeon master, and everywhere there was a vile smell of blood. Such a plant can hardly be described with words. The top of it had human eyes covered with leaves, and the rest of the body was tentacles. There was very little information about this creature, much less any knowledge of its weaknesses. Just entering the room, the traveler encountered fierce resistance. The monster was so repulsive that it was disgusting to even look at him. Memento told that the creature had changed so much under the influence of magic that it was hard to tell what it was still like. So the name of this monster is Abomination, concluded Stitch. The blast of air didn't have much effect, but it still managed to throw the tentacles back a bit. The monster looked at the intruder of his peace with astonishment at the place where his eyes should be. The monster had intelligence, but there was no time to think about it, and a sprout was already approaching the boy's face. Fortunately, the reaction was enough to dodge to the side, but it was still incredibly dangerous. It was starting to get annoying, and Stitch launched a fireball right into the center of the tree, but the path was blocked by a wall of blood. At this rate, they'll never get to this abomination. Its defenses are strong. Stitch was indignant. Isn't it too much that none of the attacks don't work? Demon asked. He hadn't noticed. Nothing strange. The boy is somehow trying to confront the creature that has dominated this place for years. He just can't handle it. Besides, even this way Cain was victimized by the monster. Now there was nothing to hope for, just throwing a lot of punches, hoping it would work. Swinging his sword to strike, Stitch marveled. So this man was a mage. It's because the monster has absorbed almost all of its power. Its tentacles are so strong. It was extremely difficult to block such a blow. It was a big problem to even resist. Even with passive skills, you can't do any tangible damage. You can only dodge. To his horror, Stitch hesitated and lost his vigilance. A sharp spur was already flying toward his face. The inevitable pain pierced every cell in his body, and it seemed like it was the end. By his arm, he was held by several tentacles. So far, Stitch had only fought plants, but had yet to absorb normal magical power. Opening the bottle of potion, the guy started to drink. Greedily, will have to save his strength for recovery. The empty vial immediately flew straight into the face of the monster, who was expecting nothing. His health was immediately restored, and his wounds healed, as if by magic, and the boy was again full of strength. This seemed to anger or amuse the monster. A wide smile appeared on his face. So the dungeon keeper was saving his prey for the future to devour. Does this creature have intelligence and can feel feelings? But it's still a nasty creature. The crosswind shredded the tentacles. In a split second, the boy's body was overwhelmed with anger. Some vile monster dared to mock a human being. A furious Stitch jumped to the ground. The monster can hit him all he wants. He still can't win. Such insolence made the monster even angrier, and now there was a grin on the vile face instead of a smile. With conditioned reflexes and crosswinds, the Stitch easily dealt with each attack, deftly avoiding the tentacles. The monster didn't seem to be able to control his emotions. If you blow up all those tentacles, there would be a good chance to take a favorable position. A mocking smile appeared on his face. Now he spoke, addressing the tree, trying to get it to emote. He was doing a great job of it. The tree, feeling helpless for the first time in a long time, was getting angrier and angrier. Eager to try something out, the traveler launched a fire jet directly into the center of the tree, mixing a fireball and a blast of air. Even with all his will, the monster couldn't defend himself against such an attack. His entire body felt as if it had gone through him. Yeah, what can I say? Even Stitch felt that unbearable heat. I think he overdid it. The demon, on the contrary, encouraged him, while here was a chance to blow everything to hell, and the guy ran straight to the monster. Next was the electric arc. Although it couldn't be used to completely destroy the monster, it was worth a try. Stitch soared upward and grouped himself for one last jump. The monster's entire body was covered in stalks, except for one non-obvious spot where the guy was actually aiming. His hand slipped easily into the monster's vile maw, and now he was in the role of hunter. Even though he was disgusted, he continued to thrust his hand into the monster's mouth. His hand began to vibrate from the cursed aura. The aura of the curse filled the entire room, destroying any living organism. With some concern, the demon noted that this skill would be. Little Stitch is sure to last the boy through his teeth, replied that he would try. Now he had an image in his mind of the haughty Prince Harold, who had once dared to mock him, and that was what gave him strength. There's no way in hell he's going to let himself be mocked now. Devour's curse traveled all over the monster's huge body, penetrating every cell and filling it with dark power. The end was a foregone conclusion. While on the surface, the elder, surrounded by his entourage, worried whether the strange stranger who had so suddenly traveled underground was alive or dead. There were quite a few elves gathered here, but no one could tell if those in the dungeon were alive. With bitterness in her voice, the head said that this is the limit for the Redwood, so need to go down and suppress the dungeon. The general tried to stop her. He wanted to say something else, but he felt a strange energy near him. From somewhere appeared the elves, still being prisoners of the creepy dungeon this time. They were alive and well. Raising his hand, Nazir ordered to hold back fire. It was his own. A shocked Chester couldn't believe that all the missing people had suddenly returned completely intact. The elder and the elf woman close to her opened their eyes in surprise, and it was hard to believe. Even seasoned generals were at a loss for words at the miracle they saw. The most amazing thing was that Mr. Drainer was alive and unconscious. Seeing her long-missing father, Elena immediately rushed to him, screaming. Nazir, who still didn't believe in such a miracle, was surprised even more than before. In a weakened voice, Drainer called his daughter and mother closer. Elena wrapped her arms around his pale face. Looking at the weeping faces of his living relatives, Draenor finally breathed a sigh of relief. The elf, who brought the others with him, apologizing for going over the top, asked to send the troops to the dungeon. The general raised an eyebrow in utter bewilderment at this insolence. But the elf told me that some man had single-handedly saved the Lord, and moreover given him the scroll of return. So, help was needed. But it seemed unnecessary now, as a rumbling sound came from the depths of the dungeon, shaking everything around him. A jet of dust erupted from the dark passage. There, something beyond comprehension was happening. Even the hitherto hesitant elder cried out that this man needed help, and they just had to send troops. Without giving it much thought, General Nazir immediately ordered Chester to go to the dungeon with Ada. To the surprise of everyone else, the Stitch emerged from the dungeon, talking to his familiar and resenting the fact that his leg had not recovered yet. It wasn't until a few moments later that they noticed the genuine surprise and delight on the elves' faces. All the elves standing around erupted into shouts of joy as they greeted their savior, who had destroyed the tree. At this time, many kilometers away from here, the castle was restless. The northern borders had been unattended for too long. Prince Harold stopped Balstock's indignation by ordering him to stay here. After all, they had talked about something earlier. The warlord stiffened and began to recall their recent conversation. The prince handed him a small piece of paper, ordering him to scrutinize this letter. At the same time, the prince said that his scout had recently discovered a new dungeon in the Kingdom of Potions. Balstock immediately realized what he was talking about. The prince ordered to choose the best warriors, and rather go for the artifacts. Must be careful, or there may be an international scandal. The stunned warrior nodded his head, fully aware of the responsibility placed upon him. The prince jumped on his horse and rode towards the northern borders, ordering his aide to move out as soon as he was done. Balstock nodded his head. Together with Helena, Stitch advanced along the forest path. He decided to be the first to strike up a dialogue by addressing the girl. May she not misunderstand, but still they were going to the human village. You can't walk around like that. After all, Elena opened her eyes and assured him that it was okay. Others would see her as a normal person. It sounded weird, at least. Maybe it's some kind of elf magic. No wonder, though, not even dungeon sensing. Draenor recently narrated that among the elves are found such as their kind who are sensitive to magic. They can visualize magical flows. However, when the atmosphere accumulates in one place, such events occur that make one's head spin. It is at times like this that the dungeon is born. Looking up, Stitch summarized in short. Now somewhere not far away, a new dungeon is being created. The demon rejoiced. No one will finally be out of the way. Looking at the map, Stitch noticed it won't take long to capture it before others rush in. With concern on her face, Elena asked, so when he was going therefore she wanted to go together, it was a little surprising. However, the boy did not refuse, and now they were already walking together towards the dungeon, and the demon was muttering to himself as always. The elf's dexterity will come in very handy on the next journey, so you can't ignore that. Plus, the dungeon exploration ability is a very valid argument. With a little excitement in her voice, Elena asked what was ahead. In a cheerful voice, Stitch replied, soon they would be approaching a village of people there to rest, and then another week on the road. Soon, they approached the appointed place, and the guy asked his girlfriend not to interfere with anything for the time being. In his manner, the demon remarked that the guy had better be worried about himself. He is still wanted, for which Stitch asked if he himself would recognize him. Recalling the poster, Memento sighed heavily. The human ability to replicate appearances was impressive after all. At the entrance, they were met as usual by a guard who asked for names. Stitch called himself Brian Gosling. Elena did not immediately realize who he was talking about. Then it was her turn. She almost said her name but changed it to Serena Grace. The guard looked at the two with disbelief, but still let them pass, ordering them not to lose the plaque. Stitch admired that the girl had done well, but she still had one question. And why, after all, they should hide their name to this question, the boy did not find anything to answer. The sarcastic demon, as always, showed up at just the right time to finally get to that dumbass. He never said he was wanted, did he? Soon, they approached the tavern there. Stitch promised to explain everything. By the way, it was noisy inside and it was uncomfortable to have a dialogue in such an environment. The elven girl still couldn't get used to this pace of life, but the guy hurried to reassure her. This would continue day after day, and so a large mug with a drink was politely slid toward them. Elena, who had lived in the forest until then, had seen something like this for the first time and stared at the dishes in amazement. Still, the girl decided to try the unusual drink and tasted the glass. Not a minute later, she spit all the contents back at what Stitch was very surprised. After all, this drink was considered very tasty. Demon confirmed that people's tastes are hard to understand. The guy realized he couldn't avoid the conversation, so he decided he needed to clear things up with Elena. At the end of the story, all the drinks were drunk and all the food was eaten, but he still managed to explain everything. Elena was a little surprised that Stitch was wanted for revenge. As strange as it sounded, it was. The guy nodded his head. If she wanted to go back to the forest, she could do so at any time. Recalling all the words Stitch had said in their first meeting, Elena finally understood their meaning. But still, because he had saved an entire nation on behalf of himself and his clan, she decided to repay the favor. Besides father and grandmother approved this decision at this moment, Stitch realized that he could not just say no to her. It's probably a case involving some king, but the girl assumed that someone like Stitch could easily handle it, and he has a rather unusual ring. Without letting her finish, the guy put his finger to his lips to show her to shut up. The visitors were already talking noisily at the back, saying that troops had already been deployed along all the roads. Stitch listened intently to the conversation, and what he heard he liked less and less. Too many people have been hurt how elusive you have to be to not be caught for so long. Without too much explanation, Elena herself realized that things had gotten complicated and there were troops on all the roads and unknown persons in the forest. When asked what he was going to do, Stitch sipped irritably from his glass of beer he didn't know himself. The Guardian told me that she's what's called a feeding trough. There's a disturbance that needs to be addressed. Stitch and Helena were already crowded together, with guards blocking the way. After learning that they needed to organize themselves into groups, the guy started to choose who would be best for them. His choice immediately fell on an inconspicuous man loading goods into a wagon, who said he was going to follow the road and turn off into the kingdom of Zeldia. That suited them just fine, and Stitch immediately suggested they walk together. The man scratched the back of his head and tried to hide his embarrassment and said he'd already found company. So you'd better find someone else. He pointed to a big fat man with a bushy beard whose name was Farquaad, to be honest. He didn't inspire much trust. Stitch noticed this immediately and grimaced in disgust at the sight of the man being a terrible cheapskate. And so, it turned out Farquaad resented in a nasty voice as a traveling companion, he would only take one. There were too many unnecessary eyes here, so it would be better not to attract too much attention. But still, the merchant agreed, and the first man gave Stitch a thumbs up and invited him into his wagon surprisingly easily. The man was curious to know what the adventurer was doing, and the guy replied that he was just hunting in the dungeons. Scratching the back of his head, Carrier said that he used to want to be an adventurer himself, but then the goblins shot him in the knee. Elena is the first to detect danger, and Stitch reminded her that on the first day, of course, nothing bad will happen, but let her be on the lookout. Smiling, the girl replied that she would take care of it, so there was nothing to worry about. Soon they stopped for a small rest and built a fire to cook a meal. This time, the future vigilant reported that so far all was quiet, to which Stitch said hopefully it would be good if it were so all the way. And then one of their traveling companions fell to the ground like a stone. The boy was frightened to see such a nightmarish sight. Someone was definitely attacking them. Soon, he himself fell to the ground. Elena immediately realized that it was particles of magic that had managed to spread. That way, they would all fall under their influence. The Elphys bounced in the other direction. As it's strange, silhouettes loomed somewhere far away in the bushes. She spotted them immediately. It was a group of several men, apparently bandits looking to make a profit. A bald man with a bandage on his face asked the chief they should search everyone. The commander shook his head. Their target was none other than the wealthy Carrier Farquaad. A man with black hair and a ponytail, apparently the leader, took a piece of meat and began to eat it with gusto. The bandits had already relaxed, but they seemed to have a problem. Someone was following them. Stitch turns out to be conscious, and in this guy was already a problem. The bandits immediately rushed at him with the whole crowd need to deal with him right away, so I'll be in trouble. That they didn't attack them so unceremoniously was infuriating. Stitch was furious. The first attack was easily repulsed by his hand, but they didn't use enough gas, and now they're attacking in droves. The boy's powerful fist soon met the face of one of the brigands, and a crunch was immediately heard. The bald mugger lunged at the survivor to finally deal with the problem, but there was not enough reaction, and the next blow came straight to his face. Seeing the boy's husband, the bandits immediately stopped fighting and took a step back. They still didn't understand what was wrong. The magic was still active. So why hasn't this kid passed out yet? Stitch at this time wondered after the red tree in his head began to appear information about new skills. Is it really a new feature? Memento hurriedly explained that it was not a function, but rather their bond had become much stronger. From those words, the mood of both of them soured. Despite all attempts to shout, the bandit boss stood in a stupor of surprise as the enemy still held on. The sorcerer who actually caused the global dream assured that there were no glitches in his magic. This guy was something special. Anger was starting to boil over. They were just planning to rob them a little, and this annoying little brat is ruining it. Stitch's anger gradually increased in front of him, standing in front of the robbers. How could this be ignored? It's doubtful anyone would just stand there and watch. In response, the bandit only mouthed a snide smile. Then we should slowly finish. The gang leader vanished into thin air. Stitch, not expecting such a turn, suddenly felt someone's foot approaching his jaw. The blow was so strong that the guy didn't have time to stay on his feet and flew to the ground. It was a good punch, but how he did it was a mystery. Without wasting any time, the robber began to disappear into thin air like smoke again. Stitch wanted to object, but a boot flying straight into his face interrupted his outrage. And then it rang in his head again, and the poor guy found himself back on Earth. The robber had to admit that there was something about this boy. He could not only withstand magic, but also bear the blows. Shale was not happy. Better instead of bullying, his boss would handle it. Not expecting his opponent to be so tough, the bandit laughed, but he wanted to take something else. Stitch was lying on the earth and did not suspect anything, but the bandits had already decided to take him with them. Elna, who had miraculously survived, watched the bandits leave in an organized group, taking Stitch with them. Watching the bandit leader, the elven woman, marveled at how quickly they disappeared. It was hard to believe they were common bandits, and why they took Stitch with them. And the only thing left to do was to keep an eye out, which Elena did. Memento and here began to ramble on about whether his ward was not too often. In such situations, after all, the opponent was only a human. Trying to justify himself, Stitch didn't understand what he should do if this bandit just disappeared, especially if there was magic there. The demon said he was watching everything that was going on, and the boy didn't seem to know what it meant to fight together. They continued to argue for a long time. Meanwhile, Stitch was already in the camp of bandits and was extremely angry that he got into such a stupid situation. The ringleader apologized with feigned politeness and extended his hand to introduce himself. His name was Gareth, saying he was a true patriot. He invited the boy to join them. Gareth was a noble outlaw. All this pathos talk seems to just get on Stitch's nerves. Stitch snorted and called out his fake name. It's not like he's crazy enough to join the bandits who kidnapped him. It was obvious that Gareth was extremely offended by such a nickname. It seems they didn't understand each other, especially they don't rob every merchant. Despite all this, somehow their speech did not inspire them to join, and why Stitch would they need it at all? But my gut did not deceive Gareth. Turning to Bald called Bernard, the leader reminded him that he had once been too, and Bernard took offense. Pointing to his mage, Gareth continued by saying that Shale had not quite mastered magic alone either. The sorcerer only remained silent. Having hit the table with his hand, the bandit asked, and thanks to whom it all happened, the wards immediately confirmed everything with glee. With a smile on his face, the man said he had a real flair for talented people. An arrow whizzed past his ear, hitting him slightly. The same arrows began to fall like hail, slicing through everything around them. Immediately, there was a commotion around them. They were under attack and had to seek shelter immediately. The only thing I wondered was what the guards were doing. Why no one warned there was a total commotion. Stitch smiled. It was a great moment. Elena had organized everything perfectly. There was a commotion, so no one paid any attention to her captive, and they could leave quickly. Gareth was furious to find out the kidnapper had other partners. That changes everything. Taking advantage of the moment, Stitch quickly ran away, and in the thick of the forest, he was already met by his friend. They were now running together, and there were many bandits around, so it was getting dangerous. Did she really bring them all? But Elena said only a few. All the guards were out, poor guys. But it was only a matter of time before a couple ran past them, hiding in the woods. Gareth had managed to catch up with them after all, and now stood blocking their path. They were surprisingly fast. He was far behind them, and they'd taken the shortest route to get here. Breathing hard, said that he never allowed to leave, even if he failed to persuade the fugitive. This annoying guy was starting to piss him off. Stitch grimaced. Without wasting a second, Gareth jumped at them, prepared to destroy them both in one fell swoop. Hit him with his fist, failed, he vanished into thin air again, and his hand went through. The demon warned that the enemy was aiming for the stomach and to be very careful. Stitch had no time to activate his conditioned reflex, but he was already hit by a powerful leg kick. By the way, he managed to dodge, which shocked his attacker. And how he had managed to see anything, Gareth was confused. Memento hurriedly explained that the man had an artifact in his cloak that allowed him to become invisible. But what the spiritual and material worlds were was decidedly unclear. Without having to explain anything, the demonic artifact simply ordered him to act, and he would decide everything himself. In his efforts to catch the fugitives, Gareth has moved back and forth between worlds. The demon immediately ordered his charge to move to the right. Stitch followed his order, and not for nothing. A powerful fist flew a few centimeters from his face, blasting him cold. Now, an opportunity to attack opened up, and a powerful fist flew straight into the attacker's ribs. Unexpectedly, Gareth gritted his teeth at the sudden flash of pain. Without delay, the Elfess launched several throwing knives directly at her opponent. The transition would take too long. Gareth didn't have time to get away from the attack. The brigands, standing in bewilderment, could not understand how this guy could notice all the attacks of their boss. It was hard to believe that he had the ability to see ghosts, because he could attack with such ease. What's more, it seems like this guy is keeping up with his boss's skills. No matter how strong the boss was, he needed help, and the sorcerer stretched his arm forward to cast a spell. But he didn't have time to do that, because a small pebble flew into his face, apparently breaking his nose. Elena's attentiveness came in handy. She was already preparing the next stone, but she can't stay away. The other attackers noticed her and immediately rushed to grab the elf. The girl applied an airflow that pushed the others back in an instant. The fact that she also had magical abilities was a big surprise. People were trying to take cover from the huge wind. Gareth could see that their boys were having a hard time too, but he couldn't help it. The suddenly regained consciousness merchant shouted in a thunderous voice for the first time in his life. At least someone was waiting for his appearance. Noticing the reinforcement, Stitch rejoiced. It was just in time, because to cope with such a pile was difficult. The merchant ordered a breakdown of the place, and his minions rushed at the criminals in a flash. The bad news is it's not their allies. Stitch realized it too late. Another bunch of people rushed at the guy who was expecting nothing. He tried to explain that he was just a traveling companion, but no one listened. These guys acted after full orders and didn't even know who they were hitting. It was pitch black here, and the man didn't understand anything and gave the order to destroy all of them, but if Stitch runs away now, he'll be wanted. There was no other option left to counterattack if such a thing as a forced measure. The newly awakened sorcerer was holding his head and didn't understand what was going on. Gareth immediately asked if he was all right. Nothing was clear, but they were found by the guys they robbed this afternoon, and now it's a real mess. Looking at the huge knight scattering bodies like toys, one could realize that he was not susceptible to physical damage. Despite this, the boss asked if the mage could suppress it even a little. It was worth a try. The sorcerer stretched his arms forward and strained all his inner energy. Invisible hands began to braid around the huge knight, trying to hold him back somehow, but unfortunately, he was immune to that as well. Things were getting worse if they came with such high-end equipment that probably thinks it's just a gang of brigands. And despite Shale's objection, the leader became transparent again and moved forward. The huge knight was surprised to feel someone sitting on his shoulder. It was Gareth, holding a knife and preparing to deliver the final blow. Much to the knight's dismay, the hard helmet on his face got in the way and the knife merely slid in tangentially. The answer came immediately. Two huge, weighty fists approached the man, and he felt as if he had been hit by a train. From such power, he could not keep up and fell to the ground now in great danger. The knight was already preparing his fist to finally finish off the pesky fly. But he couldn't do it because he immediately felt the unbearable heat from the fiery projectile. Gareth didn't understand what kind of magic this was, or who these people were. Not even a knight's hard armor can withstand such heat, and the man roared in pain. What nonsense to think that some helmet will save from skills. Memento seemed to be satisfied, and laughed with joy. Stitch did not understand what he so amused. The knight struggled to rise, leaning on his huge sword that was twice as big as the entire Stitch. If the thug ever hits with this giant, there'll be nothing left alive. It looks a little heavy for a normal person. Stitch bounced back just in time to be safe, but still the recoil from the blow shook the ground. It wasn't the first time the guy had encountered such thugs, and it was starting to get annoying. One punch to the joint, and this whole cabinet falls to the ground, which the guy did. Elena arrived just in time. She moved incredibly fast and had time to be in several places at once. The girl immediately grasped the knight's powerful neck with her hand and tried to restrain him. Then came a powerful jolt that toppled the huge man to the ground. From such a thing, the knight definitely couldn't resist and fell to the ground almost unconsciously. Gareth ran up to Stitch, and I asked him in surprise if he'd just been riding around. So what changed? The guy said he'd been mistaken for one of the bandits. He's had enough of these royals, so he can at least teach them a lesson with the help of bandits. The electric arc triggered as needed, and immediately several guards fell to the ground from the voltage. Everyone stopped for a second and didn't understand where such powerful magic came from. A moment later, everyone was tied up, and a disgruntled Farquaad was hurling curses at everyone. Stitch ran up, and with his hand on the trunk, tried to make it clear that the man himself seemed to realize who started it all. Gareth also wondered how it was that the guards knew where they were, All traces had been destroyed. The merchant didn't seem to want to say anything, so the mage offered some option. Digging a little behind his collar, the man pulled out a small medallion, surprised that some people still use such tags. Shale confirmed that you should have left them alone. They would have taken what they needed and left, but who thought the merchant was so hysterical? Then they turned to Stitch. The guy was about to get a drink of water but stopped. The phrase that he was fed up with everything made Gareth very wary. It seems that this stranger is also from the royal family. That's right. Sighing heavily, Stitch couldn't say that the man was completely wrong, but what was their goal? Could it be to overthrow the king? Strangely enough, the reason was similar to the usual revolution. Meanwhile, the robbers were just searching the guards. The bandit leader smiled and asked if it was okay to watch the country go downhill. In addition, this merchant is a representative of Venice, of which there are only a handful, one of those merchants who support the Northern Front. It made Stitch think, of course their goals overlap, but it's going to take a lot more time than that. Turning to him, Stitch asked if he could go or if they were going to keep everyone here. At last, the brigand inquired if Stitch could tell anyone about them, but that the fellow only snorted, in that case letting him go was still possible. Then the man turned to his charges, ordering them to pack up, for it was time to leave. The brigands were a little upset. Gareth said a final goodbye with a hand outstretched. The man seemed to suspect that Brian was not the traveler's real name. Stitch smiled back out of politeness, but he didn't want to cross paths with this guy again. Still, they shook hands, and that was the end of their adventure. Soon, Stitch together with Elena still found another dungeon. With the help of the search skill, it turned out to be much easier. The cave looked completely untouched, which was odd. The passage was completely clear, then it was best to go inside. Inside the dungeon, it was damp and smelled of something foul. Stitch walked ahead, pointing the way. The elven girl twitched slightly as if she had noticed something. She thought there was a monster wandering around somewhere nearby. The guy noticed too, but it was only a goblin that immediately disappeared around the corner. When asked if Elena had ever fought with goblins, she nodded her head. There are a lot of them in the forest, sometimes a whole pack of them. Stitch nodded her head. She couldn't judge the ones she'd seen in the forest, but she'd have to be careful with the underground ones. Suddenly he stopped, with his arms stretched forward, blocking the path. The elfess was a little surprised. Ahead was an obscure structure, apparently a goblin trap that could be very dangerous. Running the weapon down, the guy cut the small, almost invisible fishing line. As soon as he did so, immediately several goblins pounced from somewhere from the darkness of the dungeon. Of course he saw everything and immediately prepared a fireball. These things could not be ignored. The goblins were immediately covered in fire, and in a second, there was nothing left of them. Let this be a lesson to Elena. Underground goblins are very dangerous creatures. The girl shivered with fear, but her companion was right. These monsters are extremely repulsive. The artifact began to vibrate, pointing the way and glowing with a bluish light along with it. Mila held it in her hands and tried to find the right path. As expected, there are a few monsters here, and the keeper is quite low level. Raymond and Emmerich bickered amongst themselves. The timing is certainly good, but no one in their squad knows how to use wayfinding. But still, everyone agreed that the artifact was also quite useful, but still there was something wrong here. Mila stretched out her hand and noticed that the stretch was broken, so someone had been here, maybe a monster, or maybe another visitor. But the thread was neatly cut, so it wasn't a monster. Raymond also thought it was suspicious. So far, no monsters had gotten in their way. Emmerich called out to them, saying that there was something here, and it looked very strange. In front of them was a whole bunch of them from the goblins that had taken their lives. Maybe it was a troll, but the bodies were completely burned. In a new dungeon, there could hardly be a monster capable of doing such a thing, so there must be someone else here besides them. They need to hurry, and in the meantime, Stitch and Elena were moving deeper into the dungeon. Well, here they are. The guy touched his hand to the cold door, leading somewhere else in the room. It seems that there should be a dungeon keeper there. It could be understood by the characteristic sounds of this monster called Sea Devil. The demon's clue was just right. By the way, if you don't hit all 9 eyes, you can't defeat him so easily. The monster looked pretty nasty. Without thinking long, Stitch lunged straight at the monster and grabbed hold of one of its limbs. The electric arc immediately pierced through the monster's body and the monster roared. Mila heard something happening somewhere in the depths of the dungeon, and tensed up, everyone else stopped as well. The dungeon keeper showed up to the light. He had already been awakened by someone. It seems to be the same people. Elena was already preparing to launch a few arrows at the monster. The bowstring was stretched to the limit. Watching how they easily deal with the monster, it is clear that goblins are not a problem at all, but the artifact must get to the squad. The girl ordered Raymond to get ready to shoot, at which he raised an eyebrow in surprise. And seriously, what about the target? Pointing at Stitch, she said it would only take one shot in the back of the guy's head, and they'd take it from there. There was nothing to do, and Raymond drew the bowstring and took good aim. Not really interested in attacking an unarmed man on the way out, Raymond wished him a happy holidays. Much to Raymond's surprise, he noticed that his target was moving with such speed that it dodged his arrow. Only it was unclear how he was moving at such a speed. My eyes went to my forehead. Stitch had seen all of this perfectly well, and now his maddened gaze was already looking in the direction of the gunman. Emmerich grabbed his comrade and pulled him aside, trying to save him from the fire jet. The boys were alive, but very frightened. Raymond asked his comrade if he was all right. Stitch asked with nervousness in his voice. And who are they only? Let them not say they didn't know people were here. Scared to death, Raymond didn't understand how this guy had just used magic. So a bunch of burned out goblins is his doing. The situation stopped getting more and more dangerous. Stitch was losing patience and was ready to use electric arc. Emmerich came to his aid in time to shield his comrade and take the full damage. The demon explained that it was a form of storage shield that could be used to absorb magic. The unfortunate soldier tried his best to hold on, but it was clear that this guy was no ordinary mage. In the end, the arrow-studded dungeon keeper roared with rage and opened his wide maw. Elena jumped up to her comrade and asked what he was doing and who all these people were, but Stitch himself didn't know anything and was angry. Then we need to deal with them first. The girl said she'd help him. If so, with his hands well away, Stitch prepared for another throw. His next blow went straight into the shield. This time he kicked, as magic was ineffective. Elena had already drawn her bow and took good aim, but the arrows did not reach their target, and Mila easily deflected them with her daggers. The girl swung her weapon and prepared to fight back no matter what it cost her. To his surprise, Stitch felt that his body felt as if he was bound by some rope. Emmerich, who had come to his senses, was already running at the bound guy with his shield out in front of him. Raymond fired another arrow perfectly. Now came their end. It was impossible to miss. The crosswind worked instantly, breaking the shackles and pushing everyone away from Stitch. The few arrows Raymond had fired had all flown upwards and were now ready to fall like rain. Luckily, the guy was able to bounce aside in time, and the arrows just stuck into the concrete floor a few centimeters away from him. Whatever they're doing, it's a strange pixie who's stopping it. Meanwhile, Stitch has asked who they are and why they're after them. The demon's voice wryly remarked how they could not even give their enemy even a small clue. Does nothing at all come to mind at the sight of such well-trained guys? Stitch shook his head. Even if their target is he unknown, who it could be. There was one suggestion, but it was nonsense. The Herald couldn't have sent them here. It was nonsense. Mila Saeed, the plans have changed. Let her allies take over this guy and she'll take care of the elf girl. Albeit with a slight tremor in his voice, Emmerich agreed and they moved forward together. Meanwhile, the dungeon keeper had recovered and the newcomers had another problem. Mila immediately approached the Elfis and began to strike with ferocity. Elena, who had not expected this, defended herself with her bow, but it was getting worse. In addition, the dungeon keeper has also become active and is now targeting his prey. With its jaws wide open, it was preparing to unleash a blast of energy designed to destroy all life. Stitch saw that his friend was in danger, but unfortunately, there was nothing he could do. As soon as Emmerich noticed his opponent's hiccup, he immediately struck with his powerful shield. He still didn't have enough speed, and Stitch quickly bounced back. The guy had better take care of himself. The guy had already released a jet of air into him that the man could barely contain. Raymond took good aim and prepared to fire a hail of arrows. Luckily, Stitch was able to dodge the arrow, but one slid across his cheek, leaving a small scratch. Even though he activated crosswind, opponents are slowly getting used to its effects. You need to deal with these two first, or they will continue to cause problems. Elena looked at her rival with an exasperated look that was starting to get out of hand. Meanwhile, the monster was preparing to unleash its full power on its victims. It was necessary to act as soon as possible. Mila struggled to close herself against the wind, but still managed to stay on her feet. Because of this wind-created fire, it seems the Elfis wants to increase the distance. The girl didn't have time to do anything before Elena was already behind her. This was followed by a powerful leg kick. The girl couldn't react in time and staggered. The Elfis said that just because she has a bow in her hand doesn't mean she's not to be feared in close combat. It made sense. Mila was fully prepared for it, so don't underestimate her. She swung around, aiming her opponent right in the face. Their fists simultaneously reached their target, and the girls felt a burning sensation on their cheeks. From such a powerful blow, they were thrown in different directions unpleasantly. Sure, they clung to each other again. Neither girl was going to back down. Both were excellent fighters in close combat and fought almost equally. Swinging her bow, Elena still managed to throw her opponent a short distance away. Bouncing off the wall, Mille noticed that the monster was looking at her with all eyes. Even though it was dangerous, but the girl landed right on the monster's head, revealing her sword. She was just in time to notice that Stitch was using the electric charge again. But this time, the power was much greater. The girl immediately shouted to Emmerich that their opponent was up to something, so one should be careful. The man realized it himself, but still he couldn't do anything. His body was paralyzed. We had to stop Stitch any way we could, but the guy had already seen it. Mila used her weapon to ride the monster. In the wide mouth of the Guardian, a powerful charge of energy began to appear again. Stitch had had enough of this, so he decided to end it all once and for all by releasing a powerful charge of electricity in different directions. The opponents closed their arms in an attempt to somehow evade the attack. The guy immediately shouted to Elena to start acting. Now there might not be a better time. To his horror, Raymond was startled to see one of his arrows fly right into his face. Luckily, he managed to dodge, but there was a deep scratch on his face. The man was still asking his comrade to save the girl. Scared to death, Emmerich tried to wake up his girlfriend, who seemed to be unconscious due to the shockwave. A bad guess visited Emmerich's head, and he gritted his teeth. Stitch stood and over his shoulder watched what was happening. His opponents were seemingly disarmed. The guy then looked at the monster with anticipation now. Now he would get his experience by all means. Pushing off the ground, he jumped right into its jaws without a doubt. With a powerful airflow, he split the monster's head in 1 second. All that's left to do is eat the curse, and they've got the win in their pocket. Stitch landed on the ground, and the amazed Elena watched his every move. Looking at the team, which in a second lost all their fervor, Stitch said to go to the room with the artifact, and he will deal with the others. Noticed that it seems to be unnecessary after mining the artifact, they will bury them with the dungeon anyway. This bickering annoyed the guy, and he wondered if she had heard the story of how he survived. The Herald was too negligent, and that's why the guy stayed alive and doesn't want to make the same mistake. Swinging the boy prepared to unleash his full power on his enemies. Emmerich, unwilling to part with his life, clutched 2 pebbles in his hands, and smoke began to emanate from them. A second later, the entire dungeon area was covered in fog, hiding absolutely everything. Stitch was furious. The house veil was too bad timing. Raymond ordered his comrade to run away from here. It is impossible for the enemy to come first. The bastard tore through the fog and moved forward with all the strength he had left. Realizing that these guys wanted the artifact, Stitch ordered Elena to guard the treasure at all costs. While the guy hesitated, Raymond decided to take a chance and put an end to it all after all. Of course, he was in better condition, but at this distance, he could still manage. But no sooner had he released the bowstring than he felt a flash of pain pierce his head. His gaze crossed with Elena's. The Elfess had been wary the whole time. Stitch, not expecting anything like that, kept yelling for her to run away. Or is she saying that her partner's life isn't worth it anymore? The girl rushed after the fleeing thug without a moment's hesitation. She definitely couldn't afford their own prey, so she applied the Strider skill, speeding herself up several times. In a split second, she had easily caught up to Emmerich and was ahead of the man in a way the man had not expected. The girl threw a few daggers after him to stop the big man. The man closed his hand. Stitch was already on his way and kept shouting that you can't miss the artifact. The treasure was either a ring or a bracelet. Either way, you couldn't leave without it. Not willing to give up so easily, the soldier stretched his arm forward with only a few meters left. That annoying Stitch has already started to get really angry. It's time to stop these games. Quickly turning around, he directed a huge burst of energy towards his pursuer. The full power of his spell descended upon the knight, knocking him to the ground. The man was all engulfed in flames, his whole body pierced with incredible pain. The last thing the man saw was the scoundrels taking the artifact away. He only had time to apologize to his commander. Unfortunately, he was unable to complete the assignment, and that was the end of his story. Soon, the couple made their way out of the dungeon with one last pile of it to me. Stitch still couldn't figure out who these guys were or why they were attacking them so immediately. Elena tried to explain that based on everything, these people were after the artifact, so they immediately came close. Looking at the artifact, Stitch asked why it was needed. Memento muttered how good an artifact dungeon could be better to just gobble it up. But no, the guy did something different. Instead, he quickly put the bracelets on himself, causing the demon to be surprised. The boy replied that all the artifacts until then, he did not even have time to examine properly, as he was immediately absorbed. To his surprise, he noticed that the bracelet immediately began to act, sending an unexplainable shiver through his body. Once I put it on, information started popping up, and it turns out this artifact is called Barak. The demon continued to rage. What a fool. He lost all fear in the presence of Memento. The boy dares to wear other artifacts. If he subdues the magic, the demon won't be able to absorb the thing. Stitch laughed. He just wants to try all the options, but it looks a bit weird. The demon seemed jealous of Elena. Asked Stitch really decided not to absorb this time, to which the guy nodded his head. The enchantment worked. Interestingly, the hand began to glow, and the guy took a closer look. The pebble in her hand began to glow green, and Elena seemed to know a little about artifacts. The girl said she knows this ability can briefly endow various items with magical energy, quite an unusual skill. The boy turned to his demonic companion, saying that it was better if he became stronger, he could get more artifacts. Despite all the guy's entreaties, the demon remained resentful. He didn't like the fact that he had a rival, but there was nothing he could do about it. At the exit, they were greeted with a happy smile by a man with lush sideburns. He was surprised that there were only 2 travelers. With the same friendly smile, Stitch asked him for help, which Elena wondered if the guy knew him before it turned out to be a guide. After getting a map from him, they moved on. If you go north from here, there will be a mountain called Raksha near the mining town. Glenna clarified that the mining town was actually in the other direction, and the guy began to twist his head in different directions. Sentingma is very strictly controlled, so you can't get in that easily. You have to find another way. In a small box, he put a few stones of coins and a pouch, that it was a toll. The carrier cheerfully reported that they were incredibly lucky to have fewer commuters lately. They were standing in front of a wagon full of goods, and it was too crowded, but the man assured them it was all right. The Stitch realized at that moment that they'd have to make a new outfit. Their carriage moved forward, but at the entrance, they were immediately stopped. But recognizing that they were carrying explosives, they were only required to fill out documents and were allowed to pass. Soon, they arrived. The road was not very comfortable, and Stitch wanted to get out of the wagon as soon as possible. And so soon they arrived at their destination. The city was a real labyrinth. The carrier advised them to start by stopping at an inn. It wasn't hard to find the right place, and the bartender was surprised to find out who was there, since he'd already heard from Dalton. The bartender was a stunted gnome with a large scar on his head and a rather wild expression on his face. His name was Balthazar. After accepting the treat from him, the travelers looked at him in surprise. Did they arrive at a bad time? Balthazar hastened to explain that the situation had recently become more heated with monster attacks. On the other hand, if the guy has a head on his shoulders, he's bound to survive, the bartender said, looking at a poster of him. Stitch took a few sips and asked when the black market blacksmiths, or at least alchemists, would appear. Taking a drag from his pipe, the bartender smiled crookedly, as if the visitor hadn't fully grasped the situation. Due to the appearance of monsters, all those who are engaged in this kind of work have a hard time because of orders for repairing equipment, and also the troops are hanging around. Stitch, who had not expected this, shrieked, "So what is there to buy that all those who hang around here sell?" With a heavy sigh, the bartender said that the blacksmiths also wanted to do the business of making ordinary equipment. But these were the times. Stitch shouted that he understood the situation perfectly well, but he had his own circumstances and was even willing to pay double the price. Balthazar has agreed to find someone after all, but don't let the boy expect to be asked for money. After a few days, the guy completely lost hope money. He had money and no people. Everything was not going according to plan and threatened to fail. Elena walked over to him now, wearing her usual human clothes, which turned out to be extremely uncomfortable. The barman's booming voice broke the silence. He had good news. Stitch even cheered up. Despite his busy schedule, several people agreed to help him with his request, including the blacksmith and the alchemist. At this unexpected good fortune, the boy opened his eyes even wider. In front of him stood two dwarves and a huge-looking woman with a lush bust. The dwarf was an alchemist named Casper, and the woman was named Latira. He immediately jumped up from his seat and shook hands with the dwarves and introduced himself. Stick knew it wasn't an easy situation, but it was good that they responded. Balthazar showed with all his appearance that the dwarves had the best in the world of communications. He was incredibly pleased with himself. Casper said, "Let the boy explain what he needs first, and then they'll figure it out." Stitch immediately drew his sword and showed the others, saying that his friend had made the item. The masters looked at the object with undisguised surprise. They had seen something like this for the first time. Such a weapon just can't be picked up. Obviously, this item was of incredible strength. Stitch sat with a thoughtful look, and it was true his subject was much rarer than one would normally find in this world. Latira couldn't help but marvel at the fact that despite the finish, the sword was in such condition, and the guy wants to add explosive gas to it. To all the other gas formula that the boy offers is too hard to get, the woman asked to be given the opportunity to advise something. What about swapping the gas he named for gunpowder? Basically, the result would be the same. Casper said that the powder is much more powerful than the originally available gas, will be easier to reload and safer to move, but the costs will increase. Stitch was obviously ready for this and pulled out a weighty bag of gold, and there was something else he wanted to order, some armor as well. Casper wasn't faintly surprised, as leather armor was quite a rare thing in the current environment. He turned to his partner, to something she replied that it would be even easier. But there was one condition. The customer must personally pick out the leather material. If they try hard enough to get the leather, they will even be willing to stay awake for the job. This condition put the guy in a stalemate, and where he can get the skin. If around mine, if you can find a monster, they are all composed solely of stones. One thought did cross my mind, but what about that monster that had recently attacked the locals? It too was made of stones. The bartender remembered the stories of the survivors, but he couldn't say for sure. He immediately asked, "The boy isn't going to catch him? It's dangerous?" Stitch by then had made up his mind. Seeing the bartender's concern, the guy assured him that everything would be fine. He wasn't going to do anything stupid. Balthazar realized that the guy was lying, so there was nothing to hope for in such a case. Let him turn to someone else and pointed his finger in the direction. Somewhere on the sidelines sat a dwarf who had been asleep for a long time. He was a guard and knew everything that was going on in the city, so he could have valuable information. Heeding the advice, the lad approached and immediately offered the gnome a taste of the drink on him. The dwarf grumbled grudgingly about what he wanted. Pushing a glass of beer, the guy asked about the monster that had recently attacked the locals. The gnome snorted evilly and said that it wasn't an easy topic of conversation, and all the who's who around here were endlessly asking only about him. Stitch assured him that he was not asking out of mere curiosity. He had personally seen how the workers were attacked. Apparently, all of this finally pissed the poor gnome off, and he exploded with anger and started screaming. Just in time, Balthazar appeared and gave his comrade a powerful slap. He is their precious informant, so don't let him resent it. From all accounts, it was a manticore, a horrible creature to be seen in the desert. While they were dealing with the soldiers, one of the walls collapsed, and suddenly a monster with a torn wing appeared from there. As the conversation went on, the smile on the guy's face widened. This is exactly what you need, manticore monster with bat wings and a poisonous scorpion tail. Thanking his interlocutor for the information, the guy threw him a heavy bag of coins. The dwarf asked if he was going to catch this monster. Scratching the back of his head, the boy replied that he just needed the skin of a monster. The dwarf sighed heavily and advised him to give it up. Some simple adventurer is no match for such a monster. This seemed to upset the man very much, and he even gave the money back, but Stitch waved his hands. With pride, Stitch said actually stronger than he looks, so no need to jump to conclusions. A small flash of green-colored energy immediately appeared on the boy's finger. There was a small click, and the air was filled with electricity. At that moment, the candle behind them lit up with a green light. All those present were amazed for the first time they had seen something like this. Stitch shook his head and blew on his finger, but he can still stand up for himself, so there's no objection. The gnome drunkenly shook his head, and if the lad would fulfill one request, he would arrange everything himself. Soon, they were already moving along the gutter, and the smell here was unpleasant, to say the least, but on the other hand, they managed to avoid attention. Soon, they approached their destination. There was utter chaos, and someone's bones lying around. With instinct, the guy easily deduced what was going on here. This vile odor was literally eating my lungs so that I had to cover my nose to keep from passing out. It was probably relatively safe here. Elena saw something and turned to the boy. Someone seemed to have lost an arm, and now there was a small, faintly visible ring on that limb. A hunch popped into my head that it seemed to be a comrade of that dwarf drunkard. The boy remembered that the gnome had asked him to bring the belongings of his deceased companions as well. Good thing they caught at least one thing. Elena immediately hid the ring in her bag. They moved on. If they could find one more thing, they could go up. At this time, our couple was already being followed by a pair of someone's predatory eyes. Stitch immediately began asking his demonic companion about this manticore, but the demon didn't quite understand the question. Stitch did not stop. He wanted to learn as much information about this animal, that the monster is a monster he did not know. After briefly thinking, the skull replied that the hide is tough and resilient, so ordinary weapons would be just useless. Also, there is resistance to magic. Even with all that, this monster has a weak spot in its wings, has webbing that is pretty weak. After a few meters, a real mess began to appear. It must have been the monster's doing. The demon wryly remarked that there were no other monsters nearby capable of such a thing at the time the boy found a shovel. Suddenly, their tranquility was interrupted by someone's powerful roar that made even the air begin to vibrate. Memento reported that monster guessed he was merely waiting for the intruder to enter his territory. Elena tried to calm herself down somehow, even when her grandmother was forcing her to relive 8 hours of horror. It wasn't that scary. Now, that was interesting. Even the demon was a little scared to ask what this old elf made her do. But now is not the time to speculate. We must concentrate on the battle. The boy's plans were definitely not to stay here forever, so he prepared for battle. Elena wondered what was in his plans to destroy the monster in such a simple way, but it was a steel wire that could be used to bind his legs. He'll get close, and Elena will cover for him. The girl told him to be careful. All that was left was to figure out what this monster was. The guy enchanted his dagger in hopes that it would help deal with the monster after all. Not for nothing did he get this skill. Soon, an obscure structure made of stone, more like a nest, came into view. At the top, you could see a large egg, so the manticore must be around somewhere. It must be at least 50 years old. Stitch, who had not noticed anything, marveled that if he could get this egg, he could make good money. It's some kind of occupational disease. By the way, the guy never noticed he was already being followed by a horrible face. He probably would have continued to marvel if the huge maw hadn't come close to his head. Luckily, he managed to bounce to the side, and the monster landed nearby. The sword was still able to deflect the blow with its tail, but the recoil was quite strong, and the tail was covered in acid. The manticore was smart enough to lure them in with an egg, which by the way was very durable. Ordinary weapons couldn't even scratch it. The monster was approaching them, and now the horrible shape could be clearly seen. There were huge wings and a long tail. In that case, the best option was to just run away, which the guy immediately did. The monster, who was not going to accept this outcome, roared and rushed after his prey. He reached out his paw to finally catch the intruder's eyes. The monster's eyes burned red with rage. Stitch shot fire and lightning at the monster, hoping to get away. But even this might couldn't stop the beast, and the long tail shot out a venomous spike. The situation was heating up, and magic should be more useful than normal attacks, so Skull ordered him to continue. Eventually, the accumulated damage should make itself known. Now, it is important to wait for the moment. Raising its tail, the manticore again shot out several venomous spikes. But if the spike touches his skin, Stitch is in danger of melting. He immediately shouted, calling out to Elena, who was somewhere nearby and waiting. The girl immediately understood everything and instantly shot at the monster with good aim. The arrow whistled through the air as it approached the monster, but the manticore didn't move. Her skin was so tough that the arrow just bounced off her like a metal surface. It wasn't hard to guess that she had armored skin, but Elena kept firing again and again. The arrows didn't seem to do any damage, but they should have at least delayed the monster. Elena jumped aside after Stitch's shout, and the unsuspecting monster went tumbling to the ground. The fireball was already ready and flew straight at the intended target. Then an explosion sounded. The Elphys continued to release arrows one after another without stopping for a second. Through the rumble, Stitch shouted for her to keep firing and keep firing. The manticore didn't seem to take damage, it just flapped its wings, and the spell and arrows couldn't reach it. Following that, the monster flapped its huge wings, and all the spells along with the arrows simply dissipated. Fear appeared on Elena's face. She thought that the monster could not be defeated at this rate. Stitch seems to have thought it through. He's decided to take the melee and let the girl stay a little behind. Without further ado, he rushed straight for the monster, leaving a frightened Elena behind him. It was a chance to target a weak spot. He jumped on the monster's body and took aim. As soon as Stitch managed to use his sword, the monster roared in pain. Immediately spotting her opponent, the manticore jabbed at him with her powerful forehead, pressing him against the wall. The pain was incredibly intense. Stitch thought, at this rate, he wouldn't have a whole bone left. Seeing that her comrades were in danger, Elena shrieked in surprise. But there was nothing to worry about. The guy had a recovery, he was still alive, and just slid down the wall. Memento hastened to warn Stitch not to put high hopes on recovery. This skill just restores strength, not heals. Stitch sighed heavily and pointed his finger at the monster. Under the manticore's wing was a sword, so basically, it worked. Now all that's left to do is aim for the skull. Said it's great to get the sword in, but what's the guy planning to fight with now? On the other hand, it wouldn't be the first time for him to use a critical moment as a chance for victory. He stretched his arm forward and shot electricity. The full power of his spell rained down on the manticore's body, and a loud roar shook the cave. Even the demon was surprised at their luck. The blast goes through the center of the body through the sword. Gritting his teeth, Stitch continued to do damage, even though his strength was diminishing. Finally, the manticore flapped its wings and let out a roar so loud I had to clamp my ears to keep from going deaf. The poisonous tail was already ready to release its spikes, and the danger was increasing. With a crosswind, the guy easily repelled the attack, but just a little more, and there would be tragedy. The monster didn't give Stitch a break, and was already swinging his paw to deliver the final blow. Elena loaded 2 arrows into her bow at once, and drew the bowstring to the limit. At that moment, the monster lowered his huge paw, but luckily, Stitch managed to jump back. Following that, Manticore shifted her gaze to the Elphys sitting on a nearby rock. Elena tried to hide. Her arrows were running out, but the girl didn't even notice that the poisonous tail was already flying towards her. Stitch, who had seen it all, rushed to his friend's aid and grabbed her in time to carry her back. Ordered to move towards cover, the guy ran forward, needed to finish soon. He looked closer and saw that the monster had stopped for some reason. It must be storing up damage. I wondered why he was still alive. The manticores absorbed so much damage. The demon reappeared and assured that the damage to the monster guy has done, just not yet had the final blow. Stitch regretted that he did not take with him Penetrator. It's better to let him look around instead of thinking, because the monster has already prepared his paw for the next blow. It was possible to stand, and this time reaching out, the guy applied an electric arc. A powerful charge went through the monster's entire body and stopped it slightly. It was obvious that the manticore was already tired, and its movements had become more imprecise. Stitch saw it too, and shuddered a little. Something strange was going on. Eventually, the exhausted monster fell to the ground. It seems victory was evident. Stitch jumped closer to examine the monster. He couldn't believe it was over. The dangerous tail was already behind the unsuspecting Stitch's back, but Elena's arrow averted disaster in time. The girl watched everything carefully from afar, though she couldn't hear, but Memento decided to praise her. Since he doesn't have any other weapons, Stitch took a shovel. He'll have to use the tools at hand. With one apt blow, he separated the monster's wing from its body with a loud crunch. The monster roared in pain, revealing a wide mouth full of sharp teeth. I even had to cover my ears. Stitch's head was threatening to fall apart from the volume. Demon, along with Elena, marveled at the tenacity of this guy. Even in this situation, he continues to destroy the monster. Putting his hands on the monster's body, Stitch intended to burn it. A fireball flew out instantly. Everything seemed to have succeeded. There was a smell of burnt wool in the air. Everything was over. As soon as Elena saw that everything was okay, she immediately rushed to her partner with questions. She held out a life-giving potion for him to regain some of his strength. Although sarcastic, the demon still praised the work, especially the last part he was even impressed with. The girl lowered her eyes. She still couldn't believe that they were able to defeat such a terrible monster. Stitch drank all the potion in one go, and breathing heavily asked, "They won, didn't they?" Quickly taking care of the problem, he began to rummage through the body of the defeated, but there was nothing there. Memento was also puzzled. If you could imagine how many people were missing, there must be something left here. Stitch began to think the remains they had seen the egg, and everything else suggested a bad idea. His fears were not in vain. Another monster came out of nowhere. A powerful tail wrapped around Elena and dragged her along before she could even think of anything. Stitch immediately ran to the rescue, releasing a powerful stream of air to rescue his friend. The tail loosened, and the girl found herself in relative safety, but still the setting was horrible. Anger overwhelmed the guy. He should have known there were two of them if there was an egg. Another individual was approaching them this time. It was a female. She was much larger than the male. Bouncing high, the monster crashed straight up with its thick head into the unsuspecting Stitch. From such a strong blow, the guy flew off to the side, where the poisonous tail was already waiting for him. Turning around didn't work, and a wave of incredible pain went through his body. Unfortunately, Elena could not help him, but watched the horrible spectacle. The boy hissed through gritted teeth that she shouldn't come near this place. It was dangerous. With the help of a fireball, he was barely able to get out, his body taking serious damage. The monster had managed to wound him with its tail, and now the acid had gotten inside. Elena rushed forward to pull herself together. She's fine. Before she could get any closer, the Elphus collided with the tail that slammed into her immediately. The manticore was much faster and much stronger than the previous one. Stitch's mind was all jumbled up as the acid was starting to take effect. The demon was screaming for the guy to use the purification potion immediately. Having drunk all he needed, the traveler wondered what was wrong with Elena. The girl was lying on the side of the blow, was incredibly strong in principle. She was alive, but if not coping with the monster, will be bad. That's right, if I don't destroy it, they're all dead. The guy took up the dagger with all his might. The female looked at him with a fierce look. She must protect her child at all costs. With a powerful gust of air, Stitch managed to deflect the poisonous spike flying at him. Small attacks the demon will block, and Stitch let him focus on destroying the monster. The enchanted sword began to glow green with new magical properties. Stitch rushed into the attack. No matter how huge this manticore is, it's still a living creature. With one blast of air, he blocked the blow with his tail and jumped high up. Because of the dust that had risen, the monster waved its paw in an attempt to clear its eyes. He grabbed his sword and rushed to the attack, gathering all his strength. He swung the blade at the monster's wing, and there was a crunch and a crackle, but it seemed to work. Following that, the guy pushed himself away from the unsuspecting monster's muzzle. The dagger was immediately in the monster's eye, and Stitch caught hold of its wide mouth. The recovery was working, as it should only remained. To strike the final blow, a smile spread across the traveler's face. The monster tried to push the guy away. The manticore didn't expect such fierce resistance. After flying a few meters, Stitch stopped somewhere on Earth, breathing heavily. A grimace of surprise and fear contorted the monster's face, and a distinct fear appeared in its eyes. Stitch, on the contrary, felt a surge of strength now he's in the role of hunter. Just now this monster was lunging at him. Now he's looking at him like this. Thankfully, Elena came to her senses, and rubbing her aching head seemed to render her unconscious for a short while. Waking up, the girl didn't understand what had happened to this monster. Stitch had somehow changed. Now his eyes were burning green, and he looked intimidating. The demon admired his fighting spirit, but the strength is only enough for one skill, but it was enough. Handing the girl an enchanted dagger, Stitch said that it was necessary to finish monster will not last long. In a calm voice, he asked the girl to cover him, to which the Elphus nodded. An electric arc flew into the manticore's muzzle, causing incredible pain. The guy tried his best. While there was a sword in the monster's eye, there was a chance of hitting the brain. The manticore had already lost most of its strength and began to fall to the ground. Now everything was definitely working out tightly. Holding onto his shovel, the guy approached the defeated monster. Another blow went straight into the monster's eye, and a loud roar was heard. Stitch yelled for Elena to destroy the monster's tail immediately, or else all was for nothing. Jumping a little closer, the girl separated the poisonous tail in one deft stroke. It was heavy, but the guy grabbed hold of it and pointed it straight at the monster, and soon it was over. At last, they had succeeded. Memento was happy for his ward. It seemed he was even proud. Balthazar couldn't believe his eyes. It couldn't be the two standing nearby, also opened their mouths in surprise. The travelers dragged the remains of the monster to the tavern, which turned out to be quite a lot. It was a fascinating sight. Stitch confirmed there were 2 females and a male. They also appear to be incubating an egg. Hearing about it, Balthazar was even more surprised. Holding the very egg, Stitch was smiling. Besides, the guy wanted to pay for the information, but the bartender waved his hands. Let him keep it. The dwarf's face brightened with joy as he smiled and said Stitch had paid him back for providing such a sight. Some of those present wanted to touch the prey, but Balthazar shouted for them to remove their hands immediately. Stitch then walked over to the gnome drunkard and placed the bag of items in front of him. As soon as he saw what was inside the pouch, his jaw dropped. Scratching the back of his head, Stitch apologized guiltily for not being able to find something more. Despite all this, the dwarf had tears streaming down his cheeks, but there was nothing to apologize for. On the contrary, the guy deserved the highest praise. Smiling Stitch was satisfied with the work he had done. He managed to do 2 things at the same time. As soon as Casper saw the egg, his eyes widened with surprise. It was the first time he had ever seen something like this in reality. Latira marveled at the monster's skin. It was so tough. It was a whole other level. Balthazar. Seeing all this, he shouted, they may spin their prey in their hands, but if they try to talk, he'll get them out from under the ground. Stitch, who was sitting next to him, chuckled softly at how important this dwarf was. The woman blacksmith said that for two monsters, the skin is a little small. Of course, it is unknown how they destroyed them, but the skin is badly damaged. Stitch looked at her resentfully and grinned. Sure, he fought for his hide, but he could have stayed there. He heard Casper's voice that reminded him of the pouch, with a few parts in it, after upgrading his weapon. With a smile on her face, Latira said that she gave the weapons to her buddy, and tomorrow they would be ready. As for the armor, it would take about 3 days. Surprised, Stitch asked why so quickly. He thought it would take much longer, to which the girl winked at him. They were not some beginners. But then Elena appeared. She was holding a broken bow with a frustrated look, but unfortunately, the blacksmith couldn't fix it. This weapon was made with elven technology, and the woman couldn't promise she could replicate it. Feeling guilty about it, Stitch apologized to his friend because it was all his fault. In a quiet voice, Eleanor reassured him this bow is already shabby and was inherited from her grandfather. Sooner or later, it was bound to break. As soon as Stitch heard this, his back ran goosebumps awkwardly came out, but the demon, on the contrary, began to chuckle. The guy hurriedly reassured her. Tomorrow they would look for the forge and he would surely find Elena an even better bow. The girl thanked her comrade. Turning around, she ran to the common room. The demon seemed to have something he wanted to say to his ward. He didn't really believe he could find anything resembling elven technology, so Stitch just told him to shut up. In the north of Venice, it was still turbulent, because it was one of the most tense parts of the front. The soldiers were doing their best to build the fence at an accelerated pace, and they were exhausted. The herald, sitting in his office, pondered the monsters coming, and he didn't really feel like listening to nonsense right now. But the guard rushed inside with the prediction ball this time. It was different on the man's face. There was clear consternation. Not expecting such insolence, the prince looked at his ward with a furious look. The orb. On the table began to speak, in Balstock's voice. A man inquired of his highness if he was alive. The aide shared the bad news, reminding the prince that he had once sent a squad to retrieve artifacts. Despite all of the prince's worst assumptions, things were even worse. They sent another team to investigate, but the dungeon was already destroyed, and all the soldiers encountered was the ruins. So the artifacts were taken by someone else. The prince was furious. He could not allow such an omission. It was impossible, Balstock said. He had chosen members of the orphan squad who had nowhere else to go, but to make a magical blood contract with them. Pounding his fist on the table, the prince said that his authority was now at stake, not some artifacts. If his brother Alfred finds out about it, we can only guess what he will do to find those who stole the artifacts as soon as possible. At this point, Stitch was looking at the huge burger on his plate with gusto and asking how many people approximately ran gun shops. Balthazar was surprised the guy wanted to buy something for his girlfriend. He didn't even know what to recommend. Replacing her weapon with the same one would not be easy. And besides, he'd heard this bow had a long history of elves, hating anything that came out of the dungeons. First, you have to go and check all the shops, but the gnome said that Stitch's girlfriend seems to have already left. She got up early and was asking how she could go outside. I doubt anything happened to her, but there are a lot of strange personalities here. Stitch was furious. So why didn't you stop her by throwing a handkerchief in the barman's face? He noticed that the elf wasn't his girlfriend. He threw on his cloak, and without another word, he ran for the exit. In the huge market, it was quite difficult to find anyone, especially an elf who knew how to hide. Stitch tried to hide in the crowd. He hadn't even had time to explain to her how to use the money. Suddenly, strange words came to his hearing. Someone was trying to persuade him to come with him. Turning his head to the side, the guy was horrified to see that Elena was in the company of some murky individuals. Hiding not far around the corner, he began to watch the situation as it seemed to be heating up. Turns out there was nothing to worry about. Even the three of them couldn't hurt her. Now, Stitch himself decided to show himself to the light. One of the men immediately inquired who the hell he was. The man immediately lunged at the stranger with a knife. But this was no danger to Stitch. He immediately dodged the blow and prepared his fist. One blow was enough to have a man lying on the ground moaning. After such a powerful blow, he seems to have lost a few teeth and lost his nose. Another thug watched with horror in his eyes at what was happening and couldn't do anything about it. Elena, who saw everything, immediately swung her foot and aimed straight at the stranger's head. Despite the fact that the girl was fragile in appearance, she had a good blow, and the man flew into the wall with a loud sound. Stitch smiled and asked if Elena was all right, to which the elf was surprised at her excitement. Looking at the defeated opponents, Stitch was a little worried, although these guys were trained, but he and Elena easily handled them. All the way, Stitch wondered why his friend had come here alone, what she was doing here. The girl guiltily answered the elves. Believed that in old objects, there is the soul of ancestors. She decided to see off the old bow to the last journey. Now Stitch seems to be starting to realize something. All the puzzles in his head are starting to come together. Bow last journey and Grandpa, is it really what he thinks it is? Hearing these words, Stitch even clutched at his heart. He felt terribly embarrassed that he was so dismissive of the subject. Although Elena said we should just burn it, and that's all, and it was hard to find a deserted place. She just really didn't want to reveal her identity if she suddenly said something unnecessary in a conversation. So I was just looking around outside, but I didn't find anything, and I wanted to go back when I met those guys. Stitch finally realized what was going on and smiled and let him wait. Elena would surely find something she liked. It didn't take long for the demon to resent him for making empty promises when he would do something about it. The chatter was getting tiresome, so Stitch tried to shut his companion up, but he had to go somewhere else. It was just another armorer's shop. In a mining town, you could find some pretty rare items. Elena's attention was immediately drawn to the onions lying nearby on the counter. They looked strong, but the girl said that they didn't seem to have been well cared for, and she knew more about it than Stitch. Memento muttered to himself under his breath that such help was of no use at all, but Elena reassured Stitch that it could be found in other cities. They were interrupted by a man jumping out of the door, who immediately apologized because he hadn't heard anything. They were about to leave, but the demon stopped Stitch. Although there are a lot of second-rate goods here, but you can find something interesting. With an irritated look at his companion, the boy demanded that he advise at least something. Their choice fell on a small handle, but what was so special about it was unclear what it even was. Soon, they were already sitting in a small bar, needing to rest. Too much had happened. Inside himself, Stick was still glad that he had managed to find something that would appeal to the elf. Elena seemed to be happy with the purchase. Stitch winked and praised the demon that the skull laughed nothing else from himself favorite and did not expect anything else from himself. Looking at the new thing, Elena smiled and said she would give him the name Recordacchio. Stitch was surprised that she came up with it so quickly. The guy wondered after he started using the cursed items, then somehow felt strange. But the demon was not the least bit discouraged by the strong fighting spirit. He even likes it now. At least it is clear that they are partners. Looking at her partner, Elena asked where they would go now, to which Stitch said he had just asked the blacksmith to take care of the outfit. Soon, they were in the field, and the guy was fighting the goblins that inhabited the area. It turns out that the local ruler does not deal with the security of his settlement at all because there are a lot of monsters. Turning to Elena, Stitch said he'd take the biggest one and let her handle the rest. Without further ado, the girl took out her bow, which turned out to be a magical item, and drew an arrow. A hail of arrows rained down on the unsuspecting monsters and began destroying them one by one. The goblin leader, fiercely holding onto his spear, ran straight at the enemy. There was the sound of a blow, and the spear seemed to have reached its target. However, Stitch stood unharmed. The guy held onto the spearhead and deftly blocked the blow, probably because the manticore's skin armor was impenetrable. If that's the case, it's time to stretch your bones. A predatory smile appeared on his face, and the goblin looked fearfully at his opponent. In the end, it was all over, but to take the souls, by the way, goblin turned out to be very easy. Hiding her bow, Elena asked, leaving that their goal was to punish the village head for being too greedy. The guy nodded his head. At the same time, they can help the villagers stop theft in the village, and Dalton has something interesting to share. A recent conversation in which Dalton had told him that the local ruler of the village of Gelen was too fond of wealth. Stitch wasn't surprised by this, but the bartender went on to say that with his means, he furiously began to collect artifacts. Soon, the couple approached the intended place. It was a rather large village in which there was a lot of excitement. To begin with, it was necessary to find an inn. As soon as the travelers entered the village, the first thing they saw was a guard taking the last pig from a peasant. Despite all entreaties, the man in the purple cloak was unrelenting. All the residents' property belonged to the ruler, so stop being stubborn. Of course, Elena couldn't bear such an injustice and immediately grabbed her weapon, but Stitch stopped her. The surprised girl asked if they shouldn't stop this robbery, but the guy offered to wait. A little boy ran out of the nearest cabin and ran up to his kneeling father. With a slight movement of his hand, the guy took out a gold coin glistening in the sun from his bag. As he got closer to the unfortunate man, he held out the fee and said they needed a night's lodging if they had a spare room. Soon the guys were inside, and having plates of soup in front of their faces was even kind of embarrassing. The owner of the place complained that these people come every time and take everything from them. First they raised the fee, and then they started picking on everything. Now they have no way to move anywhere. The man sighed heavily, leaving them to either run away or stay. With great pity, the guy looked at this unfortunate man. The situation was even worse than his own. Frowning her eyebrows, Elena wondered why these soldiers were doing this to them. Why take away the farming? With a heavy sigh, the man replied that everything was fine before these taxes were levied. But now the soldiers are not being paid their salaries. Listening to all this talk, Stitch kept thinking about his plan of capture. Most likely all the treasures should be in a hard-to-reach place. When asked how the man knew the wage situation, he said you can hear a lot of different information at the local inn. A smile appeared on his face as a place to find out the most important information at night. There were already enough soldiers in the inn to make conversation with them. During the arm wrestling competition, they got to talking. Stitch said that sometimes he works as a mercenary for a living. The soldier laughed and offered the guy a drink on him, which Stitch immediately accepted. When he heard that this boy had been mauled by a monster guardian today, he was surprised that there were no monsters in their area. The traveler smiled and replied that there were quite a few goblins on the outskirts of the village, and that the headmaster was there. The guard nodded understandingly, asking, did the traveler destroy it? Stitch scratched the back of his head and lied that he only had time to run away, and then asked how he could beat him. The bearded man laughed and couldn't believe that a tough guy like this mercenary couldn't take down such a pathetic goblin. Their conversation heated up, each of them telling their own adventures, and the guard seemed to be getting a little tipsy and tongue-tied. The alcohol hit him in the head, and the guard told him all the secrets and that all the funds went to mining artifacts. It was just what was needed. Stitch rubbed into his confidence and questioned, did the ruler have so much money? He just had one artifact hearing this. The guards looked at the bracelet with surprise and interest. The traveler immediately noticed that the guards were not as simple as they seemed honest or foolish. By the reaction, it was easy to guess. The military man laughed. Their ruler is such a spender that it's only worth showing the artifact, and he'll buy anything. The man then advised the boy to go to the fortress, where a commander named Chelsea was in charge. Thanking for the information, the boy left the inn where Elena was already waiting for him. Already tired of waiting, the elven woman asked if he had managed to get the information. The guy was extremely embarrassed. He thought it would be different, but in fact he was just drunk. Then they just walked down the night street. All the while, Elena wondered how people could drink such bitter water. She was worried that someone might be watching them. Stitch said he'd noticed it earlier, and the spy is also extremely inept. Taking the stone in his hands and energizing it, the guy prepared to throw. It was already starting to annoy him. And why are these spies so noisy? The stone immediately flew straight into the target. A stranger in a dark hood was hiding around a corner and didn't expect a rock to hit him. Stitch ordered to get out of there immediately, but the man seemed in no hurry to show himself. Soon, several of the same cloaked men came forward, and one of them told Stitch to put down the artifact and get out of here. He didn't have time to say anything as his face collided with Elena's powerful knee. After such a blow, he naturally couldn't stay on his feet and fell to the ground. The others were terrified. Even Stitch was a little surprised at such power, wondering how he had once been able to defeat Elena, to which the demon replied that it was all thanks to him. Elena continued the beating, it seems. At this rate, she will leave nothing for her partner. Soon all the bandits were disarmed and sat bound with a strong rope. When asked what their purpose was, one of them replied that it was all about the artifact. After that, he was immediately hit in the face with a kick that knocked out several teeth. Already starting to get angry, Stitch said that wasn't what he was asking about at all. As soon as he entered the inn, the gang immediately gathered. The costumes were obviously pre-prepared, so they were planning. Besides, such a plan couldn't have originated in such dumb heads. The guy was starting to lose patience. Taking the robber by the finger, Stitch said that he was a kind man, so he would give them a chance to tell everything nicely. The robber seemed to realize he couldn't get away with it, and replied that Lord Chelsea was his plan. As soon as Stitch heard that name, he stopped for a second, and it seemed to clear up. The robber went on and said that since the Count was spending all the money, it was necessary to take away some of the artifacts by force when they were brought into the country. Surprised that they hadn't thought of appropriating all these artifacts, Stitch asked where they got them. Suddenly, a familiar voice was heard from the back. It was the same guard he was saying that they weren't aware of either. Helena seemed to have painted his face well. The man said pitifully that the Lord was too good at keeping information private. After a little thought, Stitch said that in that case, there was no point in them leaving the robbers alive. Apparently frightened by this turn of events, one of them said there was something suspicious after all. The bandit told the story that not far from the residence, there is a well that is not used for its intended purpose. Once he saw that pieces of meat were dumped there,